London didn't whisper about Duke Lucien Ravenscar. It held its breath. 6'3" of calculated violence wrapped in Savile Row tailoring, he ruled England's aristocracy like a warlord disguised as nobility. Men who crossed him vanished from Parliament. Women who wanted him learned to want less. And tonight, at the winter masquerade, the most feared man in the kingdom was about to commit an act of cruelty so casual it would haunt him for 5 years. Stick with me until the end, because what happens next will shatter everything you think you know about power, obsession, and the woman who made a duke beg. Drop your city in the comments and smash that like button. You're going to need something to hold on to. Boss. The ballroom at Blackthorn Palace breathed money and menace in equal measure. Chandeliers hung like frozen explosions of light, each crystal worth more than a working man's yearly wage. The November cold pressed against the windows, but inside, 300 bodies generated enough heat and ambition to fuel a small war. Silk gowns cost fortunes. Jewelry represented consolidated family wealth. And beneath the music and champagne, aristocratic England conducted its real business, the ruthless brokering of influence through bloodlines. Duke Lucien Ravenscar stood near the eastern colonnade, a glass of scotch in his hand that he hadn't touched in 40 minutes. He didn't drink at these events, didn't dance, didn't perform the elaborate theater of charm that lesser nobles used to disguise their desperation. He simply existed in spaces, and the spaces rearranged themselves around him. His presence worked like gravity. At 32, Lucien had perfected the art of weaponized stillness. Black formal wear tailored with surgical precision. Gray eyes that evaluated everything and promised nothing. A face carved from angles that suggested both aristocratic breeding and something darker, something ancestral and predatory that no amount of civilization could fully domesticate. Women stared. He ignored them. Men calculated their approach vectors. He watched them abort before attempting. This was Ravenscar power. His father had built an empire through strategic brutality. Lucien had inherited that empire at 19 when the old duke's heart exploded during a parliamentary rage, and he'd spent the next 13 years expanding it with methodical precision. Banking, shipping, military contracts, political leverage. The Ravenscar fortune didn't just influence England. It underwrote portions of the crown itself. And everyone in this ballroom understood exactly what that meant. Lord Peter Ashford approached with the careful smile of a man trying to appear casual while sweating through his silk shirt. Ravenscar, magnificent turnout tonight. Lucien's eyes remained fixed on the ballroom floor, where couples moved through a waltz like schools of expensive fish. You need something, Ashford. The temperature in their immediate vicinity dropped several degrees. Peter Ashford was a viscount with gambling debts that exceeded his family's liquid assets. Lucien knew this because Ravenscar intelligence collected information the way other families collected art. Systematically, comprehensively, with an eye toward eventual use. Ashford's smile flickered. Just making conversation, friendly evening among peers. We're not peers. Lucien delivered the correction without heat, without malice, with nothing but factual precision. A statement of topography. Ashford existed somewhere down the social mountain. Lucien occupied the summit. Geography, not judgment. Ashford's face reddened. He opened his mouth, reconsidered his survival instincts, and retreated into the crowd with his dignity shredded, but his financial situation unchanged. Lucien returned his attention to the ballroom. Watching. Always watching. Because power required constant surveillance. The moment you stopped tracking threats, evaluating alliances, measuring weaknesses, was the moment someone buried a knife in your spine. His father had taught him that before teaching him to read. Dominance wasn't a position. It was a condition that demanded relentless maintenance, trust nothing, control everything, survive. The Dowager Duchess of Pemberton materialized at his elbow with the inevitability of taxation. Lucien, darling, you're projecting menace again. It's deeply unattractive at social functions. He glanced down at the elderly woman who'd known him since childhood. She wore emeralds that could finance a small army and a smile that had outlasted 3 husbands. I'm not here to be attractive. Obviously, you're here to remind everyone that you could destroy them before dessert is served. We're all thoroughly reminded. Now dance with someone before people start rumors about your preferences. Let them. The dowager sighed with theatrical exhaustion. Your father was ruthless, but at least he performed charm when necessary. You simply radiate hostility and expect the world to accommodate it. The world does accommodate it, because they're terrified of you, not because they respect you. Lucien's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Colder, flatter. Fear is more reliable than respect. Respect requires maintenance. Fear self-perpetuates. The dowager studied him with the penetrating assessment of someone who'd survived the aristocracy's cruelties long enough to see through its masks. One day, Lucien, you're going to discover that loneliness has a cost your fortune can't cover. She swept away before he could respond, leaving him standing alone again, which was exactly how he preferred it. Isolation wasn't loneliness, it was strategy. The orchestra transitioned into something lighter, more forgettable. Young Lord Hastings, drunk on champagne and inherited confidence, had gathered a small crowd near the refreshment table. His voice carried across the marble floors with the particular projection of aristocratic males who'd never been told to shut up. I'm telling you, Ravenscar's the only man in England who could make the Queen apologize. Saw him eviscerate Lord Blackwood in Parliament last month. Absolutely surgical. Blackwood tried to block the railway expansion, and Lucien just stood up, didn't even raise his voice, and said, Hastings attempted an impression, lowering his voice to a theatrical rumble. Your opposition has been noted and dismissed. This vote will proceed. Your relevance will not. Was. The crowd laughed. Lucien didn't react. He'd heard worse imitations. 3 days later, Hastings continued, Blackwood's shipping contracts mysteriously collapsed. Coincidence, naturally. More laughter. Nervous now. Because everyone present understood that Ravenscar vengeance wasn't theoretical. It was documentary fact. A woman's voice cut through the group's amusement. Quiet, but clear. Perhaps Lord Blackwood had legitimate concerns about the railway's environmental impact. The laughter died. Hastings turned toward the speaker with the delighted cruelty of a cat discovering a mouse. My dear Lady Seraphina, are you suggesting the Duke of Ravenscar should prioritize trees over progress? Lucien's attention shifted for the first time that evening. Lady Seraphina Vale stood at the refreshment table's edge, holding a glass of water she hadn't drunk from. Early 20s. Medium height. Brown hair arranged simply, without the elaborate constructions other women deployed like architecture. Her dress was well made but unfashionable, dark blue fabric that suggested mourning without committing to it fully. She was, by London's savage standards, invisible. Her father was Viscount Edmund Vale, whose gambling addiction had disintegrated the family fortune 6 years ago. Her mother had died bringing her into the world. No brothers to inherit. No sisters to provide alliance opportunities. The Vales existed now as decorative remnants, present at events through historical momentum rather than current relevance. London aristocracy had a word for families like this. Expired. Seraphina's voice remained steady despite Hastings' attention. I'm suggesting that power applied without consideration for consequence is indistinguishable from tyranny. The ballroom's ambient noise seemed to contract. Hastings' smile sharpened. Strong words for the daughter of a man who gambled away his children's inheritance. Color rose in Seraphina's cheeks, but she didn't retreat. My father's failures don't invalidate the observation. No, Hastings agreed, but they do make it amusing coming from you. The cruelty landed with surgical precision. Several people in the immediate vicinity looked away, not from sympathy, from embarrassment at witnessing such an unequal exchange. Hastings turned toward the broader crowd, drunk on the attention and his own wit. What do we think? Should we ask the Duke himself? Perhaps he'd enjoy dancing with Lady Seraphina. Show her that Ravenscar power isn't quite as terrifying as philosophy suggests. The suggestion detonated into laughter, vicious, crystalline laughter that acknowledged the joke's multiple levels. The absurdity of Lucien Ravenscar, England's most powerful unmarried noble, dancing with the daughter of a disgraced viscount. The visual comedy of pairing absolute dominance with complete insignificance. The schadenfreude of watching someone already socially destroyed be humiliated further. Hastings addressed Lucien directly across the ballroom. What say you, your grace, willing to reward Lady Seraphina's philosophical courage with a waltz? 300 people stopped pretending not to watch. This was the moment. The tiny social murder that would be retold in drawing rooms for weeks. Not because it mattered politically or financially, but because aristocratic England survived on a diet of others' degradation. Lucien looked at Seraphina Vale for the first time. She met his eyes. No tears, no pleading, just exhausted dignity bracing for impact. And in that fraction of a second, Lucien made his calculation. This girl represented nothing. No alliances, no wealth, no strategic value. Acknowledging her existence served no purpose. Dancing with her would raise questions about his judgment. Defending her would suggest weakness. The mathematics were simple. He spoke into the silence with the flat precision of someone stating obvious fact. I do not reward mediocrity with attention. The ballroom inhaled as one organism. Then the laughter came. Louder now. Meaner. Because Lucien Ravenscar had delivered the killing blow personally. There was no recovery from this. No social rehabilitation. When the Duke himself declared you mediocre, London's verdict became permanent. Hastings nearly doubled over with delight. Seraphina stood absolutely still beneath the chandelier's brutal light. Her face had gone pale, but her expression remained eerily composed. She didn't flee, didn't collapse into tears. She simply stood there, absorbing the laughter like someone learning to breathe underwater. Lucien turned away, dismissing her with the finality of someone closing a book they'd finished reading. The orchestra resumed playing. Conversations restarted. The ballroom returned to its normal rhythms of ambition and alcohol. Within minutes, the moment had been absorbed into the evening's general cruelty, noteworthy only as a particularly good example of Ravenscar ruthlessness. Lucien resumed his position near the colonnade. He'd forgotten Seraphina Vale before the waltz ended. Or so he believed. What he didn't see was the expression that crossed her face as she set down her water glass and walked steadily toward the ballroom's exit. Not heartbreak, not shame. Something colder. Something calculating. Something that looked disturbingly like purpose being born from humiliation's ashes. She disappeared into the November night without saying goodbye to anyone. And for the first time in the Vale family's diminished history, no one noticed her absence as loss. 3 days later, Lucien stood in his study at Ravenscar Keep, while London's rain hammered against windows that overlooked the Thames like a predator watching prey. The study reflected everything about its owner: dark wood, minimal decoration, books organized by strategic value rather than aesthetics. A desk large enough to conduct interrogations. Walls lined with maps showing Ravenscar holdings across England like a military campaign's progress charts. His attorney, Marcus Thorne, sat across from him with documents spread between them like evidence at a trial. The Whitmore contract is ready for your signature, Marcus said, sliding papers forward. Once executed, you'll control 60% of Manchester's textile production. Lucien scanned the contract without touching it. Whitmore's oldest daughter. Status? E. 18. Adequately attractive. No scandals. Her father's offering her as part of the arrangement. Believes a marriage alliance would secure his cooperation long term. He's correct? Marcus waited. He'd worked for the Ravenscar family long enough to recognize when his employer was calculating variables invisible to others. Lucien's finger traced a line in the contract without reading the words. Whitmore gambles. Small stakes currently, but the pattern's established. Within 5 years, he'll have debt exposure we can exploit. The daughter becomes leverage. Accept his offer. Structure the engagement for next spring. Marcus made notes without comment. This was standard Ravenscar strategy. Identify weakness, create dependency, extract maximum value, human relationships as financial instruments. Anything else? Marcus asked. The Vale situation. Status report. Marcus's pen paused. Sir? Viscount Edmund Vale, his current financial position. Marcus flipped through a separate folder he'd brought, anticipating various topics. The Ravenscar intelligence apparatus tracked hundreds of noble families. The Vales barely registered as relevant, but information existed nonetheless. The Viscount's creditors are circling. His Cheapside property will be seized within the month. He's been attempting to borrow against his title, but no one's lending. The family's essentially insolvent. His daughter, Lady Seraphina. Something in Lucien's tone made Marcus look up. Yes, Lady Seraphina. She's been liquidating personal items to cover household expenses. Jewelry, mostly, family pieces. There's a rumor she's been tutoring merchants' children for money, though that's unconfirmed. Lucien stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. Rain distorted London into abstract shapes. Somewhere in that gray confusion, a disgraced viscount's daughter was selling her inheritance to survive. Irrelevant, Lucien said quietly. Sir, the Vale family. Their decline doesn't impact our interests. Stop tracking them. Marcus hesitated. Ravenscar intelligence didn't stop tracking people without reason. Stopping implied the subject mattered enough to require deliberate ignoring. Of course, shall I? That's all, Marcus. The dismissal was absolute. Marcus gathered his documents and departed, leaving Lucien alone with London's reign and thoughts he couldn't quite categorize as strategic. He'd destroyed Seraphina Vale at the winter masquerade 3 nights ago, crushed her publicly with 6 words that barely qualified as effort, standard aristocratic cruelty, the kind of casual annihilation that happened a dozen times per season. So why did her face keep appearing behind his eyes when he tried to sleep? Not her humiliation, her composure during it, the way she'd stood absolutely still while laughter crashed over her like waves against cliffs. No tears, no fleeing, just exhausted dignity, refusing to break even when breaking would have been merciful. Lucien pressed his palm against the cold window glass. He'd seen men face bankruptcy with less poise, had watched rival lords collapse under pressure lighter than what he'd applied to a 23-year-old woman whose only crime was suggesting that power required thought, mediocrity. He'd called her mediocre. The word felt wrong now in a way he couldn't articulate, like he'd used the correct term for the wrong thing, like he'd identified a tree as worthless firewood without noticing it was still growing. Lucien pulled his hand back from the window, leaving a brief palm print that faded as he watched. This was weakness, sentimentality. Exactly the kind of soft thinking that destroyed empires. His father would have beaten this tendency out of him if he'd seen it forming. The girl meant nothing, her suffering changed nothing. In 6 months, no one would remember her name. He returned to his desk and signed the Whitmore contract without reading it again. Business continued. Power expanded. The Ravenscar machine ground forward with mechanical efficiency. But that night, alone in his chambers while thunder rolled across London like artillery fire, Lucien dreamed of brown eyes that had looked at him without fear or worship, just recognition, like she'd seen exactly what he was and found it more sad than terrifying. He woke at 3 a.m, disoriented and angry. And across London, in a rented room above a bookshop in Cheapside, Seraphina Vale sat at a desk covered with letters she was writing to distant relatives in Dunmire. She wasn't begging for charity. She was negotiating her exile. By dawn, she'd be gone from London entirely. Not fleeing, retreating strategically to rebuild from foundations the aristocracy couldn't reach. Because Seraphina had learned something that night at Blackthorn Palace. She'd learned that the Duke of Ravenscar's cruelty was impersonal, reflexive, like a machine executing programming without examining code, which meant he didn't actually see her at all. And invisible people, she was beginning to understand, could move through the world with a freedom the visible never possessed. She sealed the last letter as sunrise turned Cheapside's narrow windows gold. Then she packed the only bag she'd be taking with her and walked out of London society forever. Or so everyone believed. Tapas. 4 months later, the coastal province of Dunmire existed in a completely different England than London's aristocratic theatre. Here, cliffs crashed into black water that had killed sailors for 1,000 years. Wind carved the landscape into submission. Villages clung to hillsides like barnacles. And survival mattered more than appearances because the North Sea didn't care about bloodlines. Seraphina stood at the edge of those cliffs on a March morning when the sky looked like brushed steel. She'd transformed. Not physically. She still wore simple dresses, still kept her hair arranged practically, still moved through spaces without demanding attention. But something fundamental had changed beneath the surface. In London, she'd been a ghost. Here, she was becoming architecture. The schoolhouse behind her had been a ruin 4 months ago. Just stone walls and collapsed roof where miners' children had never learned to read because literacy was a luxury their families couldn't afford. Now it had walls that kept out wind, a roof that shed rain, desks she'd built herself from salvaged timber, books she'd begged from distant relatives who'd sent them more from pity than support. 12 children attended now. Miners' sons and daughters who showed up before dawn because their parents worked shifts that started when darkness still owned the world. Seraphina taught them reading, writing, basic mathematics. Skills that would let them escape the mines if opportunity ever appeared. Knowledge that couldn't be stolen by creditors or destroyed by economic collapse. Power that lived in mines instead of bank accounts. She heard footsteps behind her on the cliff path. "Miss Vale, you'll freeze out here." Margaret Thorne was 60 years old, built like a standing stone, and ran Dunmire's only boarding house with efficiency that would shame a military quartermaster. She'd rented Seraphina a room when the young woman arrived with nothing but a bag and quiet desperation. That had been 4 months ago. They'd become something like friends in the time since. Seraphina turned from the cliff's edge. "Just thinking. About London? About what London taught me." Margaret handed her a cup of tea that steamed in the cold air. They stood together watching waves destroy themselves against rocks that had outlasted empires. "You never talk about why you left," Margaret observed. Seraphina sipped tea that tasted like peat and survival. "Someone reminded me I was mediocre. I decided to prove him wrong. By teaching minors' children to read? By building something that can't be destroyed through humiliation." Yes. Margaret studied her with the penetrating assessment of someone who'd survived enough hardship to recognize it in others. "You're angry." "I'm focused." Focused anger, then. Dangerous combination in a woman who's got nothing left to lose. Seraphina smiled without warmth. "I've got everything to lose now. The school, these children. The proof that worth isn't determined by the people who rejected me." Below them, the North Sea continued its eternal war against the coastline, losing every battle, winning through persistence. "There's talk in the village," Margaret said quietly, "about your father." Seraphina's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly around the teacup. "What kind of talk?" "That he's ill. That the London creditors finally broke him. That he's asking for you." The wind picked up, carrying salt spray and the smell of ancient violence. Seraphina had received 3 letters from her father in 4 months, all begging her to return, all promising things would be different, all written in handwriting that got shakier with each attempt. She'd answered none of them. "He made his choices," she said. "He's still your father." "He was my father when he gambled away my mother's jewelry, when he borrowed against property that should have been my inheritance, when he let London society treat me like decorative furniture because defending me would have cost him social capital." Margaret didn't argue. She'd heard this anger before. Margaret didn't. And it wasn't the kind that could be reasoned with because it had been earned through accumulated humiliation. "Just wanted you to know," Margaret said, "in case it matters." She walked back toward the boarding house, leaving Seraphina alone with the cliffs and the water and the cold certainty that returning to London would undo everything she'd built. But that night, in her small room above Margaret's kitchen, Seraphina received a telegram that changed the mathematics. "Father dead. Stop funeral. St. Aldwyn Cathedral. Stop, your presence required. Stop." She sat on her bed holding the paper until the words stopped meaning anything. Edmund Vale was dead. The man who'd created her and failed her and destroyed himself through weakness was gone. And London expected her to return for his memorial. Seraphina looked around her room. Simple furniture, books stacked on every surface, lesson plans for next week's classes, a life she'd built from Exile's raw materials. Going back meant risking everything, but not going back meant running forever. She packed her bag for the second time in 4 months. This time, she wasn't fleeing London. She was returning to show them exactly what they'd created when they taught her that invisibility was a weapon. 6 weeks later. St. Aldwyn Cathedral occupied the heart of London's most fashionable district, like a stone prayer aimed at indifferent heavens. Inside, England's aristocracy gathered for Viscount Edmund Vale's memorial service with the enthusiastic attendance people showed disasters they hadn't personally experienced. The Vale family's collapse had been public and slow, which made it entertainingly educational for everyone else. Lucien sat in the Ravenscar pew near the cathedral's front, positioned to see everything while being observed by everyone. Standard tactical placement. He'd arrived early because arriving exactly on time suggested you cared about other people's schedules. The cathedral filled slowly with nobles who'd avoided Edmund Vale during his final years and now performed grief like amateur theater. Lucien watched them filter in with professional detachment. Lord Ashford, still sweating despite the cathedral's cold. The Dowager Duchess of Pemberton, wearing black that cost more than charity. Young Lord Hastings, whose drinking had accelerated since the winter masquerade. Standard assembly. Predictable mourners. Then the cathedral's main doors opened and Seraphina Vale entered. Lucien's entire focus collapsed into singular attention. She walked down the center aisle alone. 5 months had passed since the winter masquerade. 5 months since he'd destroyed her with casual precision and forgotten her by dawn. But this woman moving through the cathedral didn't look destroyed. She wore black that was neither fashionable nor outdated. Simple dress. Practical shoes, hair arranged without ornamentation. The same invisibility uniform she'd worn before. Except she wasn't invisible anymore. Something had changed in how she carried herself. Not arrogance, not performance. Just absolute certainty that she had every right to occupy space. Confidence that didn't require validation. She walked past London's elite without acknowledging their stares, straight to the front pew reserved for family. Alone. Because there was no other family left. The service proceeded with standard Anglican efficiency. Prayers for the deceased. Hymns sung by people who'd never spoken to Edmund Vale personally. A bishop's eulogy that managed to praise the dead man without citing specific accomplishments. Lucien barely heard any of it. His attention remained fixed on Seraphina's profile 3 rows ahead. She didn't cry, didn't display grief, just sat absolutely still with the same exhausted composure she'd shown while London laughed at her humiliation. The bishop concluded his remarks and invited family to speak, if they wished. Silence expanded through the cathedral. No one expected Seraphina to accept. Well-born women didn't deliver public speeches, especially not at their father's funerals. The vulnerability, the emotional exposure, the risk of breaking down in front of England's aristocracy. Seraphina stood. A ripple of surprise moved through the assembled nobles. She walked to the pulpit with steady steps that echoed off stone that had witnessed 1,000 years of prayers and lies. Reached the lectern, looked out at 300 people who'd watched her destroyed 5 months ago, and began to speak. Her voice carried through the cathedral's acoustics with unexpected strength. My father taught me many things, some intentionally, most by accident. He taught me that inherited wealth creates the illusion of competence, that society confuses pedigree with worth, that men will destroy their families to maintain appearances they can't afford. Nervous shifting in the pews. This wasn't standard memorial rhetoric. Seraphina's composure never wavered. But the most valuable thing my father taught me was exile. He taught me, through his failures, through his weakness, through his absolute inability to protect the people who depended on him, that London's approval is worthless currency. Sharper attention now. This was becoming something dangerous. Sharper attention now. You taught me the same lesson, Seraphina continued, her eyes moving across the assembly with systematic precision. Every snub, every turned back, every conversation that stopped when I entered rooms, every reminder that my father's mistakes had erased my value in your eyes. Lucien felt his chest tighten. She still hadn't looked at him directly. You taught me I was mediocre. The word landed like a blade. Several people glanced toward Lucien's pew. He kept his expression absolutely neutral. Seraphina's voice remained steady. You taught me exile was punishment. You were wrong. Distance from this world's cruelty gave me something infinitely more valuable than your approval. It gave me the freedom to discover I was never the lesser creature, only the easier target. Complete silence now. My father is dead. His mistakes died with him. But I am not my father. I am what survives when weakness is burned away. I am what grows in spaces you declared worthless. I am proof that your judgment means nothing to people who stop seeking your validation. She paused, letting the words settle like sediment. Thank you for attending his service. You can leave now. Your curiosity is satisfied. Then she stepped down from the pulpit and walked back to her pew without waiting for dismissal from the bishop. The cathedral sat in stunned paralysis. This wasn't how memorial services worked, wasn't how grieving daughters behaved, wasn't how women addressed England's power structure. But Seraphina had just rewritten all those rules in under 3 minutes. The bishop stammered through a closing prayer. The service ended, and as London's aristocracy filed out of St. Aldwyn Cathedral, every conversation centered on the same question: who was Seraphina Vale now? Lucien remained seated long after the cathedral emptied. He'd come expecting a forgettable memorial for a forgettable man. Instead, He'd witnessed something that made his pulse accelerate in ways that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with recognition. The girl he had destroyed wasn't destroyed. She'd weaponized her exile, and the woman she'd become terrified him in ways he didn't have language to describe. Because for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Duke Lucien Ravenscar was looking at someone who didn't need him, didn't fear him, didn't even acknowledge his existence as particularly relevant. He stood slowly and walked toward the cathedral's exit. Outside, London's June afternoon blazed with heat that made the city smell like horses and ambition. His carriage waited at the curb, and standing near the cathedral steps, surrounded by a small group of well-dressed individuals Lucien didn't recognize, Seraphina Vale was laughing. Actually laughing, not performing social grace, genuinely amused by something one of her companions had said. She looked nothing like the girl from the winter masquerade. That girl had been frightened, cornered, trying to survive in a world designed to destroy her. This woman had survived the world and come back stronger. Lucien found himself walking toward her before conscious thought authorized the movement. She noticed his approach. The laughter died. Her companions, sensing atmospheric change, created diplomatic distance. Lucien and Seraphina stood 3 feet apart on the cathedral steps, while London moved around them like water flowing past stones. He should say something, express condolences, acknowledge her speech, deploy the social machinery that smoothed these encounters. Instead, he just looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Brown eyes that had learned to stare back without flinching. A face that didn't beg for approval. Posture that suggested she'd walked through fire and decided heat was tolerable. She spoke first. "Did you enjoy the service, Your Grace?" Formal address, perfectly polite, absolutely distant. Like he was a stranger whose name she'd learned from gossip. Lucien's jaw tightened. "Your speech was unconventional." "Oui, oiseaux, oui." "Thank you." She said it like he'd complimented her dress. Meaningless social noise. I know what you meant. You meant I violated protocol, embarrassed my father's memory, spoke inappropriately for a woman in mourning. You meant I should have been quieter, more grateful for your attention, more aware of my position. Each sentence landed with surgical precision. Lucien felt something in his chest that might have been shame if he'd still been capable of that emotion. "That's not—" "Goodbye, Your Grace." She turned and walked toward a waiting carriage where her companions had gathered. Lucien stood on the cathedral steps, watching her leave for the second time. Except this time, she wasn't running. She was choosing to go. And that difference made all his wealth, all his power, all his carefully maintained dominance feel suddenly, terrifyingly irrelevant. His driver approached hesitantly. "Your Grace? Shall I follow that carriage?" The driver blinked. "Sir?" Lucien's voice dropped to the tone that made ministers resign. "I said, follow that carriage. Stay distant. Don't be obvious. I want to know where she's staying." The driver wisely asked no follow-up questions. 30 minutes later, Lucien received his answer. Seraphina was staying at the Ashworth Hotel in Bloomsbury. Modest establishment. Respectable but unfashionable. Exactly the kind of place someone building a new life would choose. That night, Lucien sat in his study with rain hammering the windows and a glass of scotch. He actually drank this time. His mind replayed her cathedral speech on endless loop. "I was never the lesser creature, only the easier target." The words felt like an indictment he hadn't known he'd earned. He pulled out a piece of Ravenscar stationery and began writing a letter he had no business writing. 3 attempts went into the fireplace. On the 4th, he managed something that approached honesty. "Lady Seraphina, I owe you an apology. I don't know how to properly deliver. What I said at the winter masquerade was cruel, unnecessary, and wrong. You deserved better. I failed to provide it. If you would permit me the opportunity, I would like to—" He stopped. Would like to what? Apologize in person? Explain his thinking. Justify behavior that couldn't be justified? Admit that she'd been occupying his thoughts for 5 months with increasing frequency and concerning intensity? He crumpled the letter and threw it toward the fireplace. It missed and rolled under his desk. Lucien stared at the empty paper for a long time. Then he did something he almost never did. He admitted he had no idea what to do next, because the Duke of Ravenscar had just discovered that the woman he'd casually destroyed had become the first person in England he couldn't control. couldn't intimidate, and couldn't stop thinking about. And that realization was going to burn everything he'd built to the fucking ground. The crumpled letter sat under Lucy's desk, like evidence of a crime he hadn't yet committed. 3 days had passed since Edmund Vale's memorial service. 3 days since Seraphina had delivered her cathedral speech and walked away from him like he was background architecture in someone else's story. 3 days of Lucien Ravenscar doing something he hadn't done since childhood, obsessing over a problem his power couldn't solve. He stood at his study window watching London's rain turn the Thames into liquid pewter. Behind him, Marcus Thorne waited with the patience of a man paid extremely well to tolerate his employer's increasingly erratic behavior. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Marcus finally broke it. "Your Grace, the Manchester textile contracts require your signature by Friday. Lord Whitmore is expecting confirmation of the engagement announcement, and Parliament wants your position on the railway expansion before the summer recess." Lucien didn't turn from the window. "What do you know about Dunmire?" Marcus blinked at the non sequitur. "The coastal province? Mining economy. High poverty. Outside London's immediate sphere of influence. Why? What kind of work exists there for educated women?" Now Marcus understood exactly where this conversation was heading, and his professional discretion warred with genuine concern. Teaching, primarily. Some charitable work. It's not a region that offers much opportunity for anyone, let alone women of Lady Seraphina's background. Lucien's reflection in the rain-streaked glass looked like a stranger. She built something there. In 5 months, she created enough of a life that returning to London was a choice, not a necessity. Marcus chose his next words carefully. "You're thinking about her." "I'm thinking about the fact that she walked away from me twice. Once after I humiliated her. Once after her father's funeral. Both times without hesitation. Most people walk away from you, Your Grace, usually while backing up and apologizing." "Exactly." The word hung in the air like gun smoke. Lucien turned from the window finally, and Marcus saw something in his employer's expression that made his next breath catch. Not anger. Not frustration. Something worse. Fascination. The Duke of Ravenscar was intellectually captivated by a problem his usual tools couldn't address, and Marcus had worked for the family long enough to know that Lucien's fascination always preceded obsession. "I need information," Lucien said. "Her activities in Dunmire. Who she's associated with in London. What she's planning next. Everything." "Sir, with respect, this feels like..." "Like what?" Marcus met his employer's eyes and decided honesty was less dangerous than cowardice. "Like you're about to make a catastrophically poor decision based on wounded pride." Lucien's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "My pride isn't wounded. My judgment was wrong. There's a difference." "Is there?" The question should have gotten Marcus fired. Instead, Lucien smiled without humor. Lady Seraphina stood in front of London's entire aristocracy and told them their opinion was worthless. She rebuilt herself in a place no one cared about and came back stronger. She looked at me like I was just another obstacle that had temporarily slowed her down. That's not pride talking, Marcus. That's recognition. Recognition of what? That I've spent 13 years surrounding myself with people who want something from me. Money, access, protection, alliance. Every relationship in my life is transactional. Every conversation is negotiation. Every smile is strategy. Marcus waited, sensing they'd arrived at the actual point. "She doesn't want anything from me," Lucien continued. "Doesn't need my approval. Doesn't fear my retaliation. She exists completely outside the machinery I've spent my entire life building. Do you understand how rare that is?" "I understand it's dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Marcus gestured at the study around them, the maps showing Ravenscar holdings like conquered territory. "Your entire empire is built on leverage. You control people by understanding what they want and either providing it or threatening it. Lady Seraphina has removed herself from that equation. You have no leverage, which means you have no control, which means any interaction with her puts you at a disadvantage you've never experienced." Lucien absorbed this analysis with the focus he usually reserved for financial reports. "Then, I need to create leverage." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Your Grace, please don't..." "Find out what she cares about. Not who. What? Her schools in Dunmire, her projects, her ambitions. Everyone has something they'll protect. I just need to identify what that is for her. And once you've identified it, Lucien's smile was the same expression he wore during hostile parliamentary negotiations. Then I'll have a reason to talk to her that she can't dismiss as easily as she dismissed my existence. This is obsession, Your Grace. This is you fixating on the first person who's ever successfully walked away from you. You're right. Marcus hadn't expected agreement, but Lucien continued. It is obsession, and I'm going to pursue it with the same focus I've applied to everything else I've ever wanted. The difference is that this time I'm doing it consciously, with full awareness of the risk. The risk being that she'll reject me completely, and I'll have to accept that some things can't be acquired through power. Marcus studied his employer with new concern. And if she does reject you? Lucien turned back to the window, watching rain destroy itself against glass that had survived 2 centuries of London weather. Then I'll learn something I've never been forced to learn before. How to want something I can't have. Seraphina sat in the Ashworth Hotel's modest dining room, pushing eggs around her plate while trying to focus on the conversation happening around her. 3 women from the London Education Reform Society had invited her to breakfast. They were earnest, well-meaning, and absolutely convinced that Seraphina's cathedral speech had been a call to action for progressive causes. They were wrong, but Seraphina was too exhausted to correct them. "Your father's memorial service was transformative," said Eleanor Blackwood, a magistrate's daughter with more passion than political acumen. "The way you challenged aristocratic complacency directly? Brilliant." Seraphina sipped tea that tasted like copper and regret. "I wasn't trying to challenge anything. I was burying my father." "But the symbolism," Eleanor pressed. "A woman claiming her voice in a cathedral, refusing to perform grief according to masculine expectations. It was radical." Catherine Marsh, older and more pragmatic, placed a hand on Eleanor's arm. "Let her breathe, Ellie. She's been back in London less than a week." Seraphina offered Catherine a grateful look. The third woman, Diana Pemberton, no relation to the Dowager Duchess, leaned forward with the intensity of someone about to propose something they believed was genius. "We want to support your work in Dunmire. Financially. Politically. The Society has connections in Parliament. We could help you expand the schools, formalize the curriculum, create a model that could be replicated across England's mining regions." Seraphina set down her teacup with careful precision. "Why?" Diana blinked. "Because education is fundamental to social progress. Because working-class children deserve opportunity. Because... No. Why do you want to support my work specifically?" The table fell silent. Seraphina continued, her voice gentle but unyielding. "You didn't care about Dunmire's miners before my father died. You didn't offer support when I was actually building those schools with salvaged timber and borrowed books. But now, after one speech that embarrassed London's elite, suddenly my work matters to you. So I'm asking, why?" Eleanor looked like she'd been slapped. Catherine recovered first. "You're right, we should have been there earlier. We weren't. But we're here now, and our resources are genuine even if our timing is opportunistic." Seraphina studied Catherine with new respect. "At least you're honest about the opportunism." Diana tried to salvage the conversation. "Will you consider our offer? Let us help you build something larger than what one woman can accomplish alone." "I'll think about it." It was a dismissal disguised as consideration. All 3 women recognized it and began making exit noises about appointments and prior commitments. After they left, Seraphina sat alone in the dining room watching London's morning traffic roll past the hotel's windows. She'd returned to London for her father's funeral, expecting to spend 3 days managing his debts and another 3 days escaping back to Dunmire. Instead, she delivered a speech that had apparently made her a symbol for causes she hadn't agreed to represent. The attention felt suffocating. In Dunmire, she'd been invisible by choice. Here, visibility was being forced on her from all directions, and she didn't have the resources to manage it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the hotel manager approaching her table with obvious nervousness. "Lady Seraphina, there's a gentleman asking to see you. He says it's urgent." "Who?" "He wouldn't provide his name, miss. Just said you'd want to hear what he has to say." Every instinct Seraphina had developed over 5 months of survival started screaming. "Tell him I'm not receiving visitors." The manager shifted uncomfortably. "He was quite insistent, miss. And he left this." He handed her a sealed envelope. Expensive paper. No return address. Just her name written in handwriting that suggested aristocratic education and absolute confidence. Seraphina opened it. Inside was a single sentence. I know about the school funding shortfall. We should discuss your options. LAR. Her blood turned to ice water. Lucien Ravenscar. Somehow, the Duke had learned about her most carefully guarded problem. The Dunmire schools were surviving on donations she'd personally solicited, and money from selling the last of her mother's jewelry. She had maybe 3 months of operating funds remaining before she'd have to close the primary location. She told no one about the financial crisis, which meant Ravenscar had intelligence sources she couldn't identify, which meant he'd been actively investigating her. Seraphina stood from the table so fast her chair scraped against hardwood loud enough to turn heads. Where is he? The gentleman? He's waiting in the front parlor, miss. She walked toward the hotel's receiving area with her pulse hammering against her throat. The front parlor was a modest room designed for brief social calls. Lucien Ravenscar stood near the window, making the space look smaller through sheer physical presence. He turned when she entered. 3 feet of carpet separated them. It felt like combat distance. Seraphina spoke first, keeping her voice level through willpower alone. Get out. Lucien's expression didn't change. I came to discuss a business proposition. I don't do business with men who investigate me without permission. I didn't need permission. Information about charitable organizations is publicly available if you know where to look. My financial situation isn't publicly available. No. But mining town economics are predictable. Donations dry up, costs increase. Idealism meets mathematics. I didn't need spies, just basic analysis. Seraphina felt her hands clench into fists. What do you want? To help. Why? The question clearly surprised him, like he'd expected anger or fear, but not genuine curiosity about motivation. Lucien took a step closer. Seraphina held her ground. Because what you're building in Dunmire matters. Because those schools will fail without proper funding. Because I have resources you need. And what do you want in exchange? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A conversation. 1 hour. You tell me about your work. I tell you what I can provide. No obligations, no strings. Everything has strings when it comes from you. Fair. But sometimes the strings are visible and negotiable rather than hidden and exploitative. Seraphina studied him with the same analytical precision she'd learned applying to mine economics and human nature. The Duke of Ravenscar didn't offer anything without extracting value, but he also didn't need to lie about his intentions because his power made honesty more efficient than deception. 1 hour, she said. Here, now. And if you try to leverage this conversation into anything beyond what you're explicitly offering, I walk away and you never contact me again. Agreed. They sat in chairs positioned like negotiating opponents. Lucien spoke first. Your Dunmire schools serve approximately 40 children across 2 locations. You're teaching basic literacy, mathematics, and practical skills. Operating costs run roughly £30 monthly. Donations currently cover half that. You're subsidizing the rest through personal funds that will be exhausted by September. Seraphina's expression remained neutral despite the accuracy. You've done your research. I always do. Here's what I'm offering. Full operational funding for 12 months. Enough to cover current expenses plus expansion to 2 additional locations. No restrictions on curriculum. No oversight of hiring. Complete autonomy. What's the cost? Lucien leaned back in his chair. Transparency. You provide quarterly reports on enrollment, outcomes, and financial expenditures. Not because I want control, because I want proof the investment is effective. That's not a cost. That's standard accountability. Exactly. Seraphina waited for the actual conditions. They always came. When Lucien said nothing, she pushed. You're offering to fund my schools for a year with no strings attached except basic reporting? Yes. Why? Because I was wrong about you. The admission hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. Seraphina's throat tightened. At the winter masquerade, Lucien continued, I judge you based on surface information and social positioning. I called you mediocre because you didn't fit the template I'd learned to value. I was comprehensively wrong. What you've built in Dunmire with no resources and active hostility from circumstance is more impressive than anything I've accomplished with inherited wealth and structural advantage. This is guilt, Seraphina said quietly. You're trying to pay for your cruelty with money. I'm trying to correct a mistake. There's a difference. The money doesn't fix what you did. I know, but it might help you do what you're already trying to do more effectively. Seraphina stood and walked to the window, putting distance between them while she thought. Outside, London moved through its morning routines, carriages, pedestrians, the machinery of aristocratic society grinding forward with mechanical indifference. She spoke without turning around. If I accept your funding, people will assume I'm your mistress, that you bought access, that everything I've built is contaminated by association with you. Let them assume what they want. You'll know the truth. So will the children learning to read because the schools stayed open. And when you decide you want something from me, when the philanthropic Duke routine gets boring and you remember you're a man who trades influence for leverage, Lucien stood as well. She heard him cross the room until he was directly behind her. Then you tell me to leave and I leave. That's the agreement. 1 year of funding with no obligations beyond reporting. After that, you decide whether to continue the arrangement or find alternative support. Seraphina turned to face him. They were close enough now that she could see the details of his face. The faint scar along his jaw from some childhood accident. The gray eyes that usually looked through people but were currently focused on her with uncomfortable intensity. I don't trust you, she said. Smart. I don't like you. Understandable. I think you're dangerous. Accurate. So why would I accept this? Because you're practical enough to separate emotional response from strategic advantage. Because turning down resources your schools need to prove a point about independence is the kind of aristocratic pride you spent 5 months escaping. Because you know I'm offering something genuine even if my motives are complicated. Seraphina held his gaze. 1 year. Quarterly reports. No oversight beyond financial accountability. The moment you try to leverage this into anything else, the arrangement ends. Agreed. She extended her hand. Lucien looked at it for a long moment before taking it. His grip was firm, controlled, and lasted exactly 1 second longer than professional courtesy required. When he released her hand, Seraphina felt like she'd just signed a contract she hadn't fully read. My attorney will draft the formal agreement, Lucy said. You'll have it by tomorrow. First quarter's funding will be available immediately. He moved toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, Lady Seraphina, I meant what I said at the cathedral. You deserved better than what I gave you. This doesn't fix it, but it's a start towards something less contemptible than my previous behavior. Then he left before she could respond. Seraphina stood in the empty parlor feeling like she'd just survived something dangerous, without understanding exactly what the danger had been. She'd accepted funding from the man who'd publicly destroyed her. Either she'd just made the most pragmatic decision of her life or the worst mistake. The problem was she couldn't tell which. News of Ravenscar's support for the Dunmire schools spread through London society with the speed of scandals and cholera. Within 48 hours, Seraphina received 14 social invitations, 9 speaking requests, and 6 marriage proposals from younger sons looking to attach themselves to whatever arrangement they assumed she had with the Duke. She declined everything and focused on drafting curriculum expansions for the new funding. But London wouldn't leave her alone. The Education Reform Society wanted her to speak at their annual conference. Progressive newspapers wanted interviews about women's education. Conservative papers wanted to know if she was corrupting working-class children with radical ideas. Everyone wanted a piece of the narrative she'd accidentally created. 3 weeks after accepting Lucien's funding, Seraphina attended a reception at the Marchioness of Queensberry's townhouse. She'd been invited specifically to discuss educational philosophy, but the room's actual interest had nothing to do with pedagogy. They wanted to watch her interact with Lucien Ravenscar. He stood near the far wall, surrounded by ministers and military contractors, conducting business while appearing to engage in casual conversation. She recognized the technique. Say nothing substantive while extracting useful information from everyone around you. She'd been avoiding direct interaction with him since signing the funding agreement. Not from fear, from self-preservation. Because every time they were in the same room, she felt the air pressure change, like a storm system moving in before the clouds arrived. The Marchioness appeared at her elbow with champagne and ulterior motives. Lady Seraphina, have you had a chance to speak with the Duke this evening? We're not social friends, Lady Queensberry. We have a professional arrangement regarding educational funding. Of course. Professional. How refreshingly modern of you both. The sarcasm was subtle but present. Seraphina took the champagne without drinking it. Is there something you'd like to ask me directly? The Marchioness smiled like a cat, considering a particularly interesting mouse. London is curious about the nature of your relationship with Ravenscar. He's not known for charitable impulses. You're not known for accepting patronage. Yet here we are with a year-long funding arrangement that benefits you considerably. Here we are, Seraphina agreed. Nothing else? Nothing that's any of your concern. Bold words for a woman whose reputation depends on appearing respectable. Seraphina set down her untouched champagne. My reputation survived 5 years of exile and my father's public disgrace. I think I can survive speculation about my professional relationships. She walked away before the Marchioness could respond, and nearly collided with Lucien, who'd materialized from the crowd with his usual terrible timing. They stood facing each other while the reception continued around them like water flowing past stones. "You're being discussed," Lucien observed. "Always am, usually for the wrong reasons. This time it's because of me." "Don't flatter yourself. I was being discussed long before you decided philanthropy was interesting." His expression shifted into something that might have been amusement. "How are the school expansions progressing?" "On schedule. First quarter report will be ready next week." "I wasn't asking for the report. I was asking how you are." The question felt more intimate than it should have. "I'm managing," Seraphina said. "Why?" "Because you look exhausted, insightful. I am exhausted. Turns out running educational programs while being London's current favorite scandal is time-consuming. You could leave, return to Dunmire, and let them think they drove me away? No. Stubborn, practical. There's a difference." Lucien's eyes held hers with uncomfortable steadiness. "They're going to keep pushing, demanding explanations, creating narratives that have nothing to do with reality. You understand that? I've lived with false narratives my entire life. I'll survive these too. What if I could stop them?" Seraphina felt warning bells start ringing. Don't what? Whatever you're about to suggest, don't. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to offer protection, intervention, some demonstration of Ravenscar power that would make people stop speculating. And I'm telling you, I don't want it. Why not? Because then the narrative becomes that I need you, that I can't handle London without ducal protection, that I'm another woman who traded independence for security, even if the protection is offered without strings? Especially then. Because that's when the strings become invisible. Lucien absorbed this with visible frustration. "So you'd rather endure their cruelty than accept help that might make your life easier?" "I'd rather endure temporary cruelty than create permanent dependency." "Yes." They stood in tense silence while the reception swirled around them. Finally, Lucien spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. Good. Maybe that'll teach you to stop trying to solve problems I haven't asked you to solve." She walked away for the second time that evening, and Lucien Ravenscar stood watching her go while realizing that he was in considerably more trouble than he'd initially calculated. Tositz. 2 months into their arrangement, everything detonated. The Crown announced its plan to consolidate noble holdings through strategic marriages designed to strengthen political alliances. Several major houses would be paired to create power blocks more easily controlled by royal interests. The Ravenscar Duchy was on the list. Lucien received the summons on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, all of London knew that Duke Lucien Ravenscar was expected to marry Lady Helena Valemont, daughter of the Earl of Valemont and one of the Crown's most politically connected families. The match was perfect, strategic, dynastically sound, and Lucien hated everything about it. He sat in his study staring at the royal decree while Marcus Thorne tried to find something useful to say. "It's a strong alliance," Marcus offered weakly. "The Valemonts control shipping routes you've been trying to access for years. The marriage would consolidate considerable power. I didn't ask for analysis. I asked for options. There aren't many. The Crown's decree carries significant weight. Refusing would be interpreted as political rebellion. Then I'll rebel." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. "Your Grace, please think about what you're saying. I have thought about it. For 8 weeks, I've watched Seraphina Vale build something real while I've been managing aristocratic theater. I'm done performing. This isn't about Lady Seraphina. This is about your family's political position. Everything is about Seraphina." The admission landed between them like a grenade. Marcus stood slowly. "You're going to refuse a crown-mandated marriage because you're infatuated with a woman who barely tolerates your existence. I'm going to refuse because marrying for alliance while wanting someone else is the kind of hollow victory my father would have celebrated. And I'm discovering I'm tired of victories that feel like failures. Your father built an empire. My father died alone and angry. I'd rather not follow that blueprint exactly. Marcus gathered his papers with the careful movements of someone trying not to trigger an explosion. What are you going to do? Lucien stood and walked to the window overlooking London's evening chaos. I'm going to find Seraphina and tell her the truth before someone else creates a narrative we both have to live with. And what truth is that? That I'm about to burn down everything I've built because the alternative is living without her. Mosul. Seraphina was in her hotel room reviewing enrollment projections when someone knocked on her door with the aggressive urgency of bad news arriving. She opened it to find Lucien Ravenscar looking like he'd walked through a storm. We need to talk. No. Seraphina? I said no. Whatever crisis you're experiencing isn't my responsibility to manage. The Crown wants me to marry Helena Valemont. Seraphina's breath caught despite her best efforts. Congratulations. I'm sure you'll be very strategic together. She tried to close the door. Lucien's hand stopped it. I'm refusing. Why are you telling me this? Because it matters that you know. It doesn't matter. Your marriage arrangements have nothing to do with me. They have everything to do with you. The intensity in his voice made her step back instinctively. Lucien took it as invitation and entered the room, closing the door behind him. They stood in the small space with too much unspoken weight between them. You need to leave, Seraphina said. Not until you hear what I came to say. I don't want to hear it. Too bad. The arrogance in that statement should have made her furious. Instead, it made something in her chest constrict. Lucien continued, his voice rough with something that sounded dangerously like honesty. I've spent 8 weeks trying to convince myself this arrangement was purely professional, that funding your schools was about correcting a mistake, that seeing you at receptions and dinners was coincidental. I was lying to myself. Don't. I think about you constantly. I engineer reasons to be in spaces you occupy. I've memorized the way you argue with people who underestimate you. I know you drink tea instead of champagne at social events because you don't trust being impaired around London's aristocracy. I know you're left-handed but pretend to be right-handed when signing documents because someone told you it looked more proper. I know— Stop. Her voice cracked. Lucien took another step closer. I called you mediocre because I didn't understand that everything I'd been taught to value was surface presentation. You're the first person I've met who's built something real without using cruelty or domination as tools. You're the first woman who's ever looked at me and seen exactly what I am without fear or calculation. And I'm terrified because I don't know how to want something this badly without trying to own it. Seraphina felt her back hit the wall. This is obsession, not affection. Maybe. Probably. But it's honest obsession. That doesn't make it better. I know. They were close enough now that she could see his pulse hammering in his throat. I'm refusing the Valemont marriage, Lucien said quietly. And I need you to understand that I'm doing it because marrying someone else while wanting you would be the kind of calculated cruelty I'm trying to stop being capable of. You're not doing this for me. You're doing it because you've decided I'm a problem you want to solve. You're right. You are a problem. The kind that makes me question everything I've built. The kind that makes power feel empty. The kind that terrifies me because I can't control you and can't stop wanting you anyway. Seraphina's hands were shaking. What do you want from me? Permission to try, to prove I can be something other than the man who destroyed you, to show you that wanting someone doesn't have to mean caging them. And if I say no, then I walk away and spend the rest of my life wondering what I could have been if I'd been brave enough to change. The room felt too small and too hot. Seraphina looked in the Duke of Ravenscar and saw something she'd never expected to see in a man who ruled through dominance. Vulnerability. Raw. Terrifying vulnerability that came from admitting he wanted something he couldn't take by force. She should refuse, should protect herself from the inevitable disaster this would become. Instead, she heard herself say the words that would change everything. One chance. You get one chance to prove you can want without owning, and the second you forget that difference, this ends permanently. Lucien's expression transformed into something fierce and grateful. One chance. I'll make it count. Then he left before she could change her mind. Seraphina stood alone in her hotel room with her heart racing and the terrible certainty that she'd just crossed a line she'd never be able to uncross. Outside, London continued its eternal routines, and tomorrow the Duke of Ravenscar would refuse a crown-mandated marriage for a woman who'd once been too mediocre to deserve his attention. The entire aristocratic order was about to discover what happened when England's most ruthless noble chose obsession over strategy. War was coming, and this time, neither of them would survive it unchanged. The Grand Sovereign Banquet at Whitehall Palace happened once a year, and attendance wasn't optional for anyone whose bloodline mattered to the crown. Lucien arrived late, which was calculated. Walking into a room already filled with England's power structure sent a message about who answered to whom. His carriage pulled up to the palace entrance while London's September evening turned the sky the color of old bruises. Inside, 300 nobles pretended civility, while conducting warfare through whispers and strategic seating arrangements. Crystal chandeliers turned the ballroom into something between cathedral and battlefield. The air smelled like expensive perfume and barely concealed ambition. Lucien moved through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of a predator in familiar territory. Men nodded. Women measured their approaches. Everyone recalibrated their evening strategies based on his presence. He was looking for one person. Seraphina stood near the eastern windows, talking to a parliamentary minister's wife about educational funding. She wore deep green tonight, simple cut, nothing ornate, still refusing to perform the elaborate costuming other women deployed like armor. Their eyes met across 30 feet of crowded marble. She didn't smile, neither did he. But something passed between them that made the air feel thinner. 3 weeks had passed since his hotel room confession. 3 weeks of careful distance while London society watched their every interaction like spectators at an execution. 3 weeks of Lucien trying to prove he could want without consuming. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Lord Ashford intercepted him before he could reach Seraphina. Ravenscar heard the news about the Valemont situation. Brave decision. The word brave meant stupid in aristocratic translation. Lucien's expression remained neutral. Strategic decision. The crown will adapt. Will they? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've painted yourself into a corner for a woman who can't offer political value. From where you're standing, Ashford, most things look confusing. It's the perspective. Ashford's face reddened, but before he could respond, a commotion near the ballroom entrance pulled everyone's attention. Lady Helena Valemont had arrived. Zeno Valemont. She moved through this crowd with the confidence of someone who'd been groomed for power since birth. Blonde hair arranged with architectural precision. A dress that cost more than most families earned annually. Beauty deployed as a political weapon, and she was walking directly toward Lucien. The ballroom's ambient noise dropped to anticipatory silence. Helena stopped 3 feet away, close enough for private conversation that everyone would strain to overhear. Your Grace, how unexpected to find you here after declining my father's very generous proposal. Her tone was honey over broken glass. Lucien maintained his composure through years of practice. Lady Helena, you look well. I look practical. Unlike some people who've apparently mistaken infatuation for strategy. She glanced past him toward Seraphina with surgical precision. The room inhaled collectively. This was blood sport dressed as social interaction, and everyone present recognized it. My personal decisions aren't subject to your commentary, Lucien said quietly. Helena's smile sharpened. Everything you do is subject to commentary. That's what happens when you're the Duke of Ravenscar. Every choice gets analyzed. Every weakness gets exploited. And right now, Your Grace, you're displaying considerable weakness. Lucien felt his jaw tighten. Helena continued, pitching her voice just loud enough for nearby nobles to catch fragments. You rejected a crown-sanctioned alliance for a disgraced Viscount's daughter, who's built her reputation on bleeding hearts and miners' charity. Do you understand how that looks? Not romantic, unstable. Lady Helena, if you have something to say it directly. I'm saying you've made yourself vulnerable. And in our world, vulnerability is terminal. She swept away before he could respond, leaving conversational shrapnel in her wake. The ballroom slowly resumed normal noise levels, but the damage was done. Helena had publicly questioned his judgment, and enough people had heard to turn it into tomorrow's breakfast conversation. Lucien crossed the remaining distance to Seraphina. She'd watched the entire exchange with studied neutrality. That went well, she observed. Helena's performing for her father's benefit, trying to salvage family pride. Is that what we're calling open hostility now? Lucien positioned himself so they appeared to be having a casual conversation while actually conducting tactical assessment. How bad will this get? Seraphina asked quietly. Bad. The Valemonts have considerable influence. They'll retaliate strategically, probably through parliament, possibly through financial warfare, because you chose me over Helena, because I chose anything other than what the crown wanted, but mostly because of me. Lucien looked at her with uncomfortable honesty. Yes, mostly because of you. Seraphina's expression remained carefully controlled, but he saw tension in the way she held her shoulders. I didn't ask you to do this. I know. I didn't want this kind of attention. I know that too. Then why? Because some things matter more than strategic advantage. I'm still learning which things those are, but you're definitely one of them. The admission hung between them in a room full of people who would weaponize it instantly if they heard clearly. Seraphina's voice dropped even lower. They're going to come after my schools. Use them as leverage against you. Let them try. Lucien. I'm serious. If supporting me becomes politically expensive, you'll have to choose between protecting your empire and protecting my work. And I need you to choose your empire. Why? Because I can rebuild schools. You can't rebuild 13 years of strategic positioning, and I won't be responsible for destroying what you've built. Before Lucien could respond, a royal page approached with a sealed message. Your Grace, from the Crown. Urgent. Lucien opened it while maintaining his expression of polite attention. Inside was a summons to private audience with the Queen's chief advisor. Tonight. Immediately. He looked at Seraphina. I have to go. What is it? Crown business. Nothing good. Be careful. Always am. He wasn't. Lately he'd been the opposite of careful. But saying that out loud felt like admitting defeat before the battle started. Lucien followed the page through Whitehall's ornate corridors toward chambers where real power negotiations happened away from public theater. Lord Chancellor Edmund Graves waited in a room designed for intimidation. Dark wood. Heavy drapes. Portraits of dead monarchs who'd executed nobles for less than political disobedience. Graves was 70, built like a tombstone, and had served the crown through 3 monarchs. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Sit down, Ravenscar. Lucien remained standing. I prefer not to. It wasn't a request. Lucien sat with deliberate slowness that communicated compliance without submission. Graves studied him with the assessment of someone evaluating livestock. You've created a problem. The Valamon alliance was carefully constructed to balance several competing interests. Your refusal destabilized arrangements that extend well beyond your personal preferences. With respect, Lord Chancellor, my personal life isn't crown property. Your duchy is. Your political influence is. Your financial holdings are. Everything you control exists at the crown's pleasure, and the crown is extremely displeased. Noted. Graves leaned forward. This isn't negotiation, boy. This is warning. You will either repair the Valamont situation or face consequences you're not prepared to handle. What consequences? For starters, your parliamentary contracts will be reviewed extensively. Any irregularities will be prosecuted fully. Your shipping routes will face new tariffs. Your banking relationships will be audited. And Lady Seraphina Vale's charitable work will discover that charitable organizations require very specific licensing to operate legally. Licensing that can be revoked. Lucien's vision tunneled. You're threatening her schools. I'm explaining political reality. You have power, Ravenscar. But power without crown support is just wealth waiting to be seized. Make the right choice. The right choice being marrying Helena Valamont. The right choice being remembering who made your family great and who can unmake it just as easily. Graves stood, indicating the conversation had ended. You have 1 week to resolve this. After that, we proceed with consequences. Lucien walked out of Whitehall with rage building in his chest like a physical force. They were going after Seraphina because he'd chosen her, using her schools as leverage because he'd made himself vulnerable, threatening to destroy what she'd built because he'd been stupid enough to think wanting something mattered more than protecting it. His carriage ride back to Ravenscar Keep happened in a blur of London's night traffic and accelerating fury. Marcus was waiting in the study when he arrived. I heard about the summons. How bad? Catastrophic. They're threatening full economic warfare, and they're going after Seraphina's schools directly. Marcus absorbed this information with visible concern. What are you going to do? Lucien poured scotch with hands that wanted to break something. Fine leverage. The crown thinks they can pressure me through her, which means I need something that makes pressuring me more expensive than allowing my choice. You're describing mutually assured destruction. I'm describing survival. If I back down now, I've confirmed that threatening people I care about is effective strategy. Every enemy I've ever made will use the same tactic. So you're willing to go to war with the crown itself, if that's what's required. Marcus stood slowly. Your Grace, please hear what I'm about to say without dismissing it reflexively. You're making decisions based on attachment rather than analysis. That's not how you've built this empire. That's not how you survive. I don't want to survive the way my father survived. Alone, feared, surrounded by people who'd celebrate my death privately while mourning publicly. Your father died one of the most powerful men in England. My father died miserable. There's a difference. Marcus gathered papers with the careful movements of someone navigating emotional landmines. I'll start building our defense strategy. But Lucien, you need to understand that protecting her might require sacrificing everything you've built. Are you prepared for that? After Marcus left, Lucien stood at his study window watching the Thames move through London like a black artery. He'd spent 13 years building power through ruthless calculation. Every decision analyzed, every relationship strategized, every vulnerability eliminated. And now he was risking it all for a woman who'd spent 5 months teaching minors' children to read. The mathematics didn't balance, which meant he was operating on something other than mathematics. His thoughts were interrupted by urgent knocking. A courier stood in the hallway, rain-soaked and breathing hard. Your Grace, from Lady Seraphina. She said it was urgent. Lucien tore open the envelope. Lucien, my school in Dunmire was raided tonight, Crown authorities. They're claiming operational violations and have shut down both locations. I'm leaving London immediately. Don't follow me. This is exactly what I warned you would happen. But the paper crumpled in his grip. They'd moved faster than expected. Retaliated within hours, destroyed months of her work to prove a point about power dynamics. And he'd been too slow to stop it. Lucien called for his carriage before conscious thought authorized the decision. Your Grace, his driver asked, where are we going? The Ashworth Hotel. Now. He arrived to find Seraphina's room already emptied. The hotel manager confirmed she'd left 20 minutes ago, hired a coach heading north toward the coast, running back to Dunmire to salvage what remained. Lucien stood in her abandoned room feeling something he hadn't experienced since childhood, complete helplessness. He tried to protect her, and instead made her a target, tried to prove he could want without destroying, and instead destroyed what she'd built through wanting. This was why attachment was weakness. This was why his father had taught him to possess rather than care, because caring about things gave enemies weapons. He returned to Ravenscar Keep and spent 3 hours drafting strategies that all led to the same conclusion: backing down or total warfare. No middle ground. At midnight, his head of security knocked with news that made the evening descend from disaster into catastrophe. Your Grace, there's been a development. Lord Damien Ravenscar is hosting a gathering at his estate. Multiple parliamentary members in attendance, including Lord Chancellor Graves and Earl Vallemont, Lucien's cousin, the ambitious nephew who'd spent years waiting for Lucien to make a mistake large enough to exploit. Get me details. Everyone attending. Full list. The report arrived within the hour. 12 members of parliament. 3 crown advisors. Multiple banking partners. All meeting secretly at Damien's estate while London slept. This wasn't random gathering. This was organized coup. They were using his refusal of the Vallemont marriage as proof of instability, building political consensus that the Ravenscar Duchy needed new leadership, someone more reliable, more obedient to crown interests. Someone like Damien. Marcus burst into the study without knocking. Tell me you've seen the intelligence report. I've seen it. And my cousin has apparently been more ambitious than I gave him credit for. Lucien, they're moving to depose you. Not financially, not socially, legally. They're going to claim mental incompetence based on your recent decisions. Petition the crown to transfer the duchy to Damien as more suitable steward. On what grounds? Erratic behavior, rejection of strategic marriage, financial support of politically questionable causes. It's actually clever. They're not attacking your competence directly, just questioning your judgment until it amounts to the same thing. Lucien felt cold settle into his bones. This was the endgame he'd ignored while convincing himself that wanting Seraphina mattered more than protecting his position. His enemies hadn't just struck at his vulnerability. They'd used it to build a scaffold for his execution. How long do we have? They'll file formal petition within 48 hours. Once it's official, the legal warfare begins. Could take months to resolve, but during that time your authority is compromised. Every decision questioned, every contract vulnerable. So I have 2 days to either surrender or strike first. Marcus met his eyes with naked fear. Lucien, if you strike first against this coalition, you're fighting the crown itself. That's not political warfare, that's suicide. Then I'll die doing something that matters, instead of living doing what's expected. He stood and moved toward the door. Where are you going? To have a conversation with my cousin about ambition and consequences. Marcus grabbed his arm. Don't. Not tonight. Not while you're angry. You'll make it worse. Lucien pulled free. It can't get worse. They've already destroyed her schools and are moving to destroy me. The only question is whether I let them do it without resistance. Resistance isn't the same as recklessness. Tonight it is. Lucien called for his carriage and armed guards. Damien's estate was 40 minutes northwest of London, and they covered the distance at speeds that risked overturning on wet roads. The house blazed with light despite the late hour. Carriages filled the circular drive, guards at every entrance. Lucien walked through the front door without announcement. The gathering in Damien's study froze mid-conversation. 12 powerful men, one ambitious cousin, all caught in active conspiracy. Damien recovered first, standing with calculated calm. Lucien, what an unexpected visit! Cut the performance. I know what you're planning. The room's tension ratcheted to breaking point. Lord Chancellor Graves cleared his throat. Your Grace, this is a private gathering. This is a coup attempt disguised as concern. Don't insult my intelligence. Damien moved from behind his desk with the confident posture of someone who believed he held superior position. You've become a liability, cousin. To the family, to the crown, to everyone who depends on Ravenscar's stability. We're simply addressing that reality. By attempting to seize my duchy. By preserving it before your romantic delusions destroy 13 generations of careful work. Lucien felt rage building behind his eyes like pressure that needed release. You think this is about romance? This is about refusing to let the crown turn me into a puppet whose strings they control through marriage arrangements. Noble sentiment. Politically suicidal execution. Earl Valemont stood, adding his authority to Damien's position. You humiliated my daughter publicly. Rejected an alliance that would have strengthened both our houses. And now you're shocked that there are consequences? I'm not shocked. I'm furious that you're using a woman's schools as collateral in political warfare. She chose to involve herself with you. That made her fair target. The words hit Lucien like physical impact. This was the world he'd built, where everything was strategy, where human connection was weakness to exploit, where people became weapons against each other. This was his empire's foundation showing itself clearly, and he hated every piece of it. Damien continued with visible satisfaction. The petition will be filed Monday morning. You can fight it if you want, but you'll lose. Half of Parliament supports our position. The Crown wants you compliant. Your own allies are questioning your stability. You've already lost, Lucien. You just haven't accepted it yet. The study fell silent except for London rain-hammering windows. Lucien looked at each man present, evaluated every face, calculated every alliance, and made a decision that would change everything. You're right. Damien blinked. What? You're right. I've made myself vulnerable, damaged my position, created opportunities for enemies to strike. Everything you've said is accurate political analysis. Damien's expression showed cautious triumph. So you'll accept the terms? Marry Helena. Restore the alliance. Prove your judgment is sound? Lucien's smile was colder than anything these men had seen from him before. No. I'm accepting that trying to preserve empire while becoming someone better is impossible. So I'm choosing which matters more. He pulled documents from his jacket. These are signed transfers. Effective immediately, I'm liquidating 60% of Ravenscar holdings. Banks, shipping, parliamentary contracts, everything that makes this duchy politically valuable. The room erupted into chaos. What? You can't... That's financial suicide. Lucien's voice cut through the noise. 40% remains. Enough to maintain the title and estates. Not enough to make me worth controlling through political marriage. Not enough to make deposing me worth the effort. Just enough to be left alone. Damien looked like he'd been hit. You're destroying your own empire to spite us? I'm destroying the machinery that turns people into assets. There's a difference. Lord Chancellor Graves stood slowly. The Crown will not allow this. You cannot simply dismantle strategic holdings out of petulance. Watch me. The transfers are legal, binding, already processed through attorneys you can't intimidate. By morning, the Ravenscar duchy will be politically irrelevant. He turned toward the door. Enjoy your victory, Damien. You can have what's left. I'm sure you'll manage it exactly as our father would have. Alone, feared, miserable. Wait. Lucien walked out while his cousin's protest dissolved into rain and distance. The carriage ride back to London happened in silence. Marcus waited at Ravenscar Keep with the expression of someone who'd just watched their world end. Tell me you didn't actually do what the emergency reports are saying you did. Lucien walked past him toward his study. I did exactly that. You've destroyed everything. 13 years of strategic building, your father's legacy, the family's political position. Everything. I've destroyed the cage. There's a difference. Marcus followed him, voice rising with each word. This isn't freedom. This is surrender. You've given them exactly what they wanted, your power, your influence, your ability to protect anyone, including yourself. Lucien poured scotch with steady hands despite the adrenaline still flooding his system. They wanted me compliant, controlled, willing to sacrifice personal choice for strategic advantage. I gave them the opposite. I became someone they can't use, by becoming powerless, by becoming free. Marcus stared at him like he'd gone insane. What happens now? Now I go to Dunmire and help Seraphina rebuild her schools, using what's left of my resources to do something that actually matters instead of accumulating power for its own sake. She doesn't want your help. She made that clear. Then I'll prove I can help without controlling, or I'll fail trying. But at least I'll fail doing something that isn't just replicating my father's mistakes in better clothes. Marcus sat down slowly. You've lost your mind. Probably. But it's the first decision I've made in 13 years that feels like choosing instead of calculating. The study fell into exhausted silence. Outside, London continued its eternal routines, indifferent to the fact that one of England's most powerful nobles had just voluntarily destroyed his own empire to escape the machinery that sustained it. Lucien finished his scotch and stared at the contracts that had ended his political life. Tomorrow he'd travel north to Dunmire. He'd find Seraphina standing in the ruins of her schools, and he'd prove that the Duke of Ravenscar could become someone worth standing beside instead of someone who dominated everything around him. Or he'd discover that some transformations came too late to matter. Either way, there was no going back. The man who'd ruled through fear and strategy was gone. What emerged from those ashes remained to be seen. But for the first time since inheriting his title at 19, Lucien felt something that might have been hope instead of hunger. And that terrified him more than any political warfare ever had. The North Sea wind hit Lucien's face like a physical accusation as his carriage rolled into Dunmire 3 days after he'd dismantled his empire. The coastal province looked exactly as brutal as he remembered from intelligence reports. Black cliffs, gray water, villages that clung to hillsides through stubbornness rather than prosperity. This was England's forgotten edge, where survival mattered more than bloodlines and the wind carved weakness out of everything it touched. His driver pulled up to what remained of Seraphina's primary school. The building stood with its door hanging at an angle, windows shattered. The Crown's authorities had been thorough in their destruction, tearing down not just operations, but the physical proof that anything worthwhile had existed here. Lucien stepped out of the carriage into cold that bit through expensive wool like it was nothing. No guards accompanied him this time. No entourage, just Marcus, who'd insisted on coming despite believing this entire journey was strategic suicide. The school's interior looked worse than the outside. Desks overturned, books scattered across floors now covered in mud and broken glass. Lesson plans torn apart. Children's drawings ripped from walls where someone had displayed them with care. Evidence of methodical cruelty designed to send messages about power and consequences. Lucien stood in the center of the wreckage and felt something in his chest that might have been grief if he'd still known how to name emotions correctly. He'd done this. Not personally, not directly. But his choice to want Seraphina had painted targets on everything she'd built, and the Crown's retaliation had been thorough enough to erase months of her work in a single night. Marcus spoke quietly from the doorway. She's not here. Village says she's been at the secondary location trying to salvage what she can. How bad is the secondary site? Same as this. Maybe worse. Lucien walked back outside where afternoon light made the destruction look almost artistic in its completeness. The secondary school was 2 miles up the coast road, built into a converted fishing warehouse that Seraphina had somehow transformed into learning space. The walk gave Lucien time to understand exactly how isolated Dunmire was from London's political machinery. No one here cared about dukes or strategic marriages or crown mandates. They cared about whether fishing boats came back and whether children lived long enough to replace parents in the mines. The warehouse appeared around a bend in the coastal path. Seraphina stood outside it, surrounded by rubble. She was pulling broken furniture into piles, organizing destruction into categories like she could rebuild from sordid wreckage. Her dress was filthy, hair falling loose from whatever arrangement she'd started the day with, hands bleeding from handling splintered wood without gloves. She looked up as Lucien approached. Her expression went from focused exhaustion to cold fury in the space between heartbeats. "Get out." The words hit harder than the wind. Lucien stopped 10 feet away. "Seraphina, I said get out, leave. Go back to London and your political warfare and leave me alone. I came to help." Her laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. "Help? You helped by making me a target. You helped by turning my schools into leverage. You helped by proving that everything I built could be destroyed the moment I became connected to your power games." She threw a piece of broken desk toward him. It landed between them like a gauntlet. "This is what your help looks like. 2 schools destroyed, 40 children with nowhere to learn, months of work erased because the Duke of Ravenscar decided I mattered more than political strategy." Lucien absorbed her rage without deflecting. "You're right." "What?" "You're right. I made you vulnerable. I should have anticipated retaliation. I should have protected your work before declaring my intentions. I failed you." Seraphina stared at him like she'd expected argument and didn't know what to do with agreement. "So now what? You apologize and think that fixes anything?" "No. Now I help you rebuild, using what's left of my resources to reconstruct what my choices destroyed. I don't want your resources. I don't want your guilt. I don't want you here." Too bad. The arrogance in those 2 words should have made her angrier. Instead, something shifted in her expression, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time since he'd arrived. Lucien continued before she could throw more wreckage. "I liquidated 60% of the Ravenscar holdings, destroyed my political position, made myself irrelevant to the power structures that used you against me. I can't undo what happened, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again by removing myself from the machinery that creates these situations." Seraphina's hands slowly lowered from throwing position. "You did what?" "I chose you over empire, and I'll make that choice every day until you believe I mean it." Marcus, standing at a diplomatic distance, made a small sound that might have been approval or distress. Seraphina walked toward Lucien slowly, each step measuring something invisible. She stopped close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands were shaking from more than cold, the absolute fury still burning beneath her fatigue. "I didn't ask you to destroy yourself for me. I know. I don't want to be the reason you became less than what you were. I'm not less. I'm different. There's a distinction." Her voice cracked slightly. "They destroyed everything. 2 years of work. Children who were learning to read. A community that was starting to believe education mattered. Gone. Then we rebuild it, together this time. I can't afford to rebuild. The funding you provided was seized when they shut us down. The donations I'd collected were confiscated as evidence of improper operations. I have nothing." Lucien reached into his coat and pulled out papers he'd prepared before leaving London. "You have this. Remaining Ravenscar liquid assets. Enough to rebuild both schools and fund operations for 5 years. Legal structure that makes it impossible to seize without proving actual criminal activity, which they can't because there isn't any." He handed her the documents. Seraphina looked at them like they might explode. "This is your inheritance, your family legacy, everything your father built. My father built machinery for controlling people. I'm repurposing it into something that actually helps them. He'd hate it, which means I'm doing it correctly." Marcus cleared his throat. "Your Grace, we should discuss the practical implications of—" "No. Seraphina and I are going to rebuild this school. You're going to help. And anyone who has opinions about whether that's strategically sound can direct those opinions somewhere anatomically uncomfortable." Marcus smiled despite himself. "As you wish, Your Grace." Over the next 6 hours, they worked. Lucien, who hadn't performed physical labor since childhood, discovered that rebuilding schools involved splinters, exhaustion, and humility in equal measure. His expensive clothes got destroyed. His hands developed blisters. His back screamed with muscles that had never been used for anything more strenuous than political intimidation. Seraphina worked beside him without softening her anger, but also without sending him away. They cleared rubble, sorted salvageable materials, began rough repairs on structural damage. Marcus coordinated with villagers who appeared slowly, cautiously, offering help once they understood the Duke of Ravenscar wasn't here to make demands but to actually work. By evening, the warehouse looked less like a crime scene and more like a building that might survive another winter. Seraphina sat on a stack of recovered timber, drinking water from a cup that had survived the destruction. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion. Lucien sat near her, maintaining respectful distance. The North Sea crashed against cliffs below them with the sound of endless violence. "Why are you really here?" Seraphina asked quietly. "Because I spent 13 years building power I didn't know how to use for anything meaningful. Because you showed me what actually matters. Because I'd rather spend the rest of my life helping you teach miners' children than spend another day accumulating influence I don't respect. That's not a life. That's penance." "Maybe. But penance done with purpose beats hollow victory." She turned to look at him directly. "You can't stay here. You're the Duke of Ravenscar. You belong in London, managing what's left of your empire. I belong wherever I choose to be. That's the only real power anyone has. Spoken like someone who's never had to choose between survival and dignity. I'm choosing now. Better late than never." Seraphina stood slowly, her body moving like someone who'd pushed past exhaustion into determination. "If you stay, you work. No special treatment because you're noble. No authority because you're funding operations. You're just another person helping rebuild." "Agreed. And if you try to control how I run these schools, if you try to turn helping into possessing, I will end this arrangement and you immediately." "Understood." She extended her hand. "One chance. Same as before. Don't waste it." Lucien took her hand, and the contact lasted exactly 1 second longer than necessary, just like the first time they'd made this arrangement. Except this time, he wasn't the Duke using resources to manage guilt. He was just a man who'd destroyed everything to prove wanting something mattered more than owning it. They released hands and turned back toward the partially rebuilt warehouse. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the coastal path above. Lord Damien Ravenscar had arrived in Dunmire with 8 armed men and a legal document that would end this entire situation permanently. Lucien spent 2 weeks rebuilding schools and discovering that manual labor was harder than any political negotiation he'd ever conducted. His hands developed calluses. His shoulders ached constantly. His expensive clothes were replaced with practical work gear that villagers donated with amusement at seeing nobility brought down to human level. Seraphina directed the reconstruction with precision that would have impressed military commanders. She knew exactly what each school needed, which repairs were essential, how to maximize limited resources. She was also slowly thawing toward him. Not romantically, not even friendly, but the active hostility was fading into something more like professional respect mixed with exhausted tolerance. They worked side by side, restoring desks, repairing walls, salvaging books. Villagers who'd been skeptical about the Duke's presence gradually accepted him as someone genuinely useful rather than performatively charitable. Marcus managed logistics from a rented room in the village's only boarding house, coordinating supply deliveries and handling the legal framework that kept Crown authorities from immediately shutting down the rebuilt schools. On the 14th night, Lucien sat on the cliffs above the primary school, watching sunset turn the North Sea into liquid copper. Seraphina appeared beside him without announcement. They sat in silence while waves destroyed themselves against rocks that had outlasted empires. Finally, Seraphina spoke. "The children are coming back, slowly. Their parents are afraid the schools will be shut down again, but they're willing to risk it. That's progress. It's survival." These families understand that education is the only way their children escape the mines. They'll take the risk because the alternative is generational poverty. Lucien watched her profile against the sunset. "You're doing something that actually matters. Building infrastructure that lasts beyond individuals. Creating opportunities that compound across generations. This is real power. Don't romanticize it. This is desperation and hard work. Nothing noble about it." "I disagree. This is the most noble thing I've ever witnessed." Seraphina turned to face him. "Stop putting me on a pedestal. I'm not doing this because I'm virtuous. I'm doing it because I was that ignored child once. The one everyone dismissed as mediocre and unworthy. These kids deserve better than the judgment I received. The sunset made her eyes look like they were on fire. Lucien felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with strategy or calculation. Just recognition that he was looking at someone who'd transformed humiliation into purpose and found strength in places aristocracy taught him to dismiss as worthless. "I owe you an apology I still haven't delivered properly," he said quietly. "You've delivered it multiple times, not for the winter masquerade. For every day I spent building an empire where your worth would be measured by things that didn't matter. For creating a world where calling someone mediocre was acceptable cruelty. For participating in machinery that destroyed people for entertainment." Seraphina was quiet for a long moment. "You can't apologize for an entire social structure." "No, but I can stop defending it, stop participating in it, stop pretending it's inevitable, and do what instead? This. Rebuild schools, support children who need opportunity, prove that power used for something other than accumulation is possible. That's a nice theory. Reality is considerably harder. I'm discovering that. My hands hurt constantly. My back feels like someone's been beating it with clubs. I haven't slept properly in 2 weeks, and I've never felt more alive." Seraphina smiled for the first time since he'd arrived in Dunmire. "Careful, Your Grace. You're starting to sound almost human." The moment was interrupted by Marcus running up the cliff path with speed that indicated serious problems. "Your Grace, we have a situation." "What kind of situation?" "The kind where your cousin just arrived with armed men and a legal order claiming you're mentally incompetent to manage Ravenscar holdings. They're demanding you return to London immediately for medical evaluation." Lucien stood slowly. "How many men?" 8. Armed, professional. Against? You, me, and whatever villagers might help. Which means we're comprehensively outnumbered." Seraphina stood as well. "What's happening?" "My cousin is attempting to finish what I started when I liquidated the holdings. He's trying to claim the remainder through legal warfare disguised as concern for my mental health. Can he do that? If he has crown support and I can't defend my competence in front of magistrates, yes, he becomes custodian of what's left, which includes controlling how remaining assets are deployed, including the school funding." "Exactly." Below them, torches appeared on the road leading to the primary school. 8 armed men moving with military precision toward the building, where 40 children would arrive at dawn to continue learning. Damien's voice carried up the cliff with aristocratic projection. "Lucien, stop hiding and face reality. You've lost. Come quietly, and I'll ensure the transition is dignified." Lucien looked at Seraphina. "Get the children evacuated. Whatever happens next, they can't be anywhere near this." "What are you going to do?" "Something comprehensively stupid that might work if I'm lucky." "Lucien, trust me, one more time. Trust that I can protect what we've built without destroying it in the process." She held his gaze for 3 seconds that felt like hours, then nodded and ran toward the village to warn families. Lucien turned to Marcus. "How many villagers would fight if asked?" "Against professional soldiers? None. These are minors, Your Grace." "Not warriors? Then it's just us. 2 men against 8 is suicide. Only if we fight on their terms." Lucien started down the cliff path toward where Damien's torches were approaching the school. Marcus followed with the resignation of someone who'd committed to following his employer into catastrophe. They reached the school's entrance just as Damien's men surrounded it. Damien stood at the center, holding a legal document that probably contained everything necessary to end Lucien's autonomy permanently. He smiled when he saw Lucien emerge. "Cousin, you look terrible. Manual labor doesn't suit you. Neither does ambition that requires destroying children's education to succeed." Dramatic words for a man who's comprehensively lost. "You destroyed your political position, alienated crown support, made yourself irrelevant. I'm just finishing what you started. By seizing the schools? By claiming what remains of our family holdings before you squander them on misguided charity. The Ravenscar duchy was built through strength. You've turned it into weakness. No. I've turned it into something that actually helps people. You just can't recognize value that isn't measured in political leverage." Damien's expression hardened. "I have legal authority. Crown backing. Armed men. You have bleeding hands and moral superiority. Guess which wins?" He signaled his men forward. Lucien didn't move. Instead, he spoke loud enough for everyone present to hear. "You want to know why I liquidated the holdings? Why I walked away from power you'd kill to possess? Because I realized that empires built on domination eventually collapse into their own cruelty. My father died alone and feared. I'd rather die here defending something real than live 50 more years accumulating hollow victories. Damien laughed. Noble sentiment, strategically worthless. Maybe. But those villagers watching from the shadows? They understand what we're actually fighting about. Education for their children versus preservation of aristocratic power. Community value versus individual dominance. Which side do you think they'll remember when your armed men leave and they're still living here? Damien's confidence flickered slightly. Because the cliff path behind them was filling with miners. 50 men carrying tools that could serve as weapons. Not professional soldiers, just fathers who'd brought their children to these schools and understood exactly what was being threatened. Margaret Thorne, the boarding house owner who'd helped Seraphina survive her first months in exile, stepped forward from the crowd. Lord Damien, you want to destroy these schools? You'll have to go through every parent in Dunmire. We're not London aristocracy. We don't care about your legal documents or crown authority. We care about our children learning to read. You threaten that, you threaten us. Damien's men shifted uncomfortably. Professional soldiers could handle 2 men. 50 angry miners with pickaxes in desperation was a different calculation entirely. Damien's voice took on warning tone. This is illegal assembly. You're interfering with crown business. Margaret smiled without warmth. Crown business doesn't feed our families or teach our children. These schools do. You want them. You'll have to take them by force. And we'll make sure everyone from here to London knows that Ravenscar nobility murders miners to preserve political power. The standoff stretched into dangerous silence. Damien's men were calculating odds. 8 professional fighters against 50 civilians with improvised weapons and home terrain advantage. Winnable, but not without casualties that would be impossible to justify legally. Damien's jaw tightened with visible fury. This isn't over, Lucien. You've made yourself an enemy of the crown itself. They'll come for you with resources I can't match. And when they do, your miners won't be able to protect you. You're right. But by then, these schools will be established enough that destroying them creates more political problems than allowing them. That's all I need. Time for roots to go deep enough that pulling them up becomes too expensive. Damien stared at him with naked hatred. You've destroyed everything our family built. I've repurposed it. There's a difference. Damien signaled his men to withdraw. They retreated up the coastal path with the careful movements of soldiers, accepting tactical defeat while planning strategic revenge. After they disappeared, the miners slowly dispersed back toward their homes. Margaret approached Lucien with an expression somewhere between respect and concern. You've made permanent enemies tonight, Your Grace. They'll come back with more men. Better legal standing. You understand that? I understand, but we bought time. That's all we needed. Time for what? For the schools to prove they're worth defending. For the children to learn enough that closing the schools becomes destroying opportunity rather than eliminating charity. For this community to become invested enough that external interference creates local resistance. That's a gamble. Everything worth doing is. Margaret studied him with the assessment of someone who'd survived enough hardship to recognize genuine commitment. You're not what I expected when I heard the Duke of Ravenscar was coming to rebuild schools. What did you expect? Performative charity. A man buying redemption with money and leaving once his guilt felt managed. Instead, you showed up and actually worked. Actually stayed when it got dangerous. Actually meant what you said about helping. Lucien felt exhaustion settling into his bones. I'm trying to become someone better than what I was. Not sure I'm succeeding, but I'm trying. Well, you've got a community here willing to fight for what you've built. That's more than most nobles ever earn. She walked away, leaving Lucien standing in front of the school that had nearly become a battlefield. Seraphina emerged from the darkness where she'd been coordinating evacuations. She walked directly to him and, without warning, wrapped her arms around him in a hug that felt like both gratitude and something more complicated. Lucien stood frozen for a moment before carefully returning the embrace. They held each other while the North Sea wind carved around them and the school stood intact behind them, and the future remained uncertain but possible. When Seraphina pulled back, her eyes were wet. Thank you for not letting them destroy this. Thank you for building something worth defending. She smiled through tears. We should sleep. Tomorrow we start repairing the damage from tonight's confrontation, and probably preparing for whenever they come back with better resources. Probably. But tonight, they'd won. Not permanently, not strategically, just enough to continue existing, which was all survival ever required. Lucien walked toward the boarding house where he'd been staying, every muscle in his body screaming from 2 weeks of physical labor, followed by the adrenaline crash of near combat. Marcus fell into step beside him. That was either brilliant or insane. I'm still calculating which. Both. It was definitely both. They're going to come back. With magistrates, crown authority, legal warfare you can't fight with mining community support. I know. So what's the actual plan? The actual plan is that we keep building until they can't tear down what we've created without revealing themselves as the villains. We make these schools so valuable to this community that destroying them requires obvious cruelty. We document everything so that if they do come after us, there's record of what happened and why. And if that doesn't work, then we've lost. But we'll have lost fighting for something that actually mattered instead of preserving power for its own sake. Marcus nodded slowly. Your father would hate everything you've become. Good. That means I'm doing it right. They reached the boarding house and separated toward their respective rooms. Lucien lay in bed listening to the North Sea's endless assault against the coastline and thinking about how much had changed in a month. He'd gone from England's most feared duke to a man whose hands were covered in blisters from rebuilding schools. From someone who measured worth in political leverage to someone who measured it in children learning to read. From a man who'd called Seraphina Vale mediocre to someone who'd destroyed his empire to protect what she'd built. The transformation should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing he'd done since inheriting his title. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the awareness that Damien's retreat was temporary. The real war was just beginning, and when the crown came with full resources and legal authority, Lucien would have to make a choice that would define everything. Fight with everything he had left and likely lose both the schools and his life. Or surrender and watch everything Seraphina had built be destroyed to prove a point about aristocratic power. Neither option was acceptable, which meant he'd have to find a third path that didn't exist yet. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, the schools stood. The children would return at dawn. And for the first time in 13 years, Duke Lucien Ravenscar would wake up knowing his work actually mattered to people who needed it. That alone made the destruction of his empire worth the cost. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the North Sea. By morning, they'd reach the coast. And with them would come the final test of whether transformation was possible, or if men like Lucien Ravenscar were condemned to repeat their father's cruelty in different forms. The answer would determine everything. The storm arrived at dawn with the kind of violence that made even seasoned coastal residents retreat indoors. Lucien woke to thunder that sounded like artillery fire and rain hammering the boarding house windows hard enough to crack weaker glass. The North Sea had transformed into liquid chaos, waves the size of buildings destroying themselves against cliffs that had survived 1,000 years of identical assaults. He dressed quickly in work clothes that no longer felt foreign and descended to find Marcus already awake, staring at documents with the expression of someone reading their own death warrant. The Crown's response arrived an hour ago, Marcus said without preamble. Official magistrate order. You're required to appear in London within 7 days for competency evaluation. Failure to comply results in immediate seizure of all remaining Ravenscar holdings, including funds allocated to the schools. Lucien poured coffee that tasted like burned survival. So Damien's legal warfare is proceeding exactly as expected. With Crown backing, that makes resistance nearly impossible. If you go to London, they'll declare you incompetent based on recent behavior. If you don't go, they seize everything anyway. Either way, the schools lose funding and your cousin wins. Thunder rolled across Dunmire like the sound of empires collapsing. Lucien stood at the window watching rain turn the coastal village into something between watercolor painting and battlefield. Somewhere in that storm, children were supposed to arrive for lessons. Families were making calculations about whether education was worth risking the Crown's displeasure. How many children showed up yesterday? He asked quietly. 43. Up from 32 the day before. Word spreading that you stood against armed men to protect the school. These families understand loyalty repaid with loyalty. And if the Crown succeeds in shutting us down, then those 43 children go back to the mines. Another generation lost to poverty because aristocratic power games matter more than human potential. Lucien turned from the window. There has to be a third option. Something between surrender and futile resistance. Marcus looked up from his documents with exhausted pragmatism. The only third option is exposure. Make this situation so publicly visible that the Crown's cruelty becomes undeniable. Force them to choose between destroying children's education in full view of England's conscience or backing down. How do we create that exposure? We don't. But Lady Seraphina might. Before Lucien could respond, Seraphina herself entered the boarding house common room, soaked from rain despite the short walk from her quarters across the street, her hair plastered to her face, dress clinging from water, eyes burning with determination that made the storm outside look tame. "I need to travel to London," she announced without preamble. "Absolutely not," Lucien said immediately, not asking permission. Stating fact. If the Crown wants to destroy these schools to punish you, then England needs to know exactly what they're destroying and why. Seraphina, don't tell me it's too dangerous. Don't tell me I should stay here where it's safe. Safe doesn't rebuild what they've torn down. Safe doesn't protect 43 children who showed up yesterday despite threats. What's your plan? Make them see the children. Make them understand these aren't abstract political pawns, but actual human beings learning to read because someone finally gave them opportunity. Make the Crown explain publicly why that deserves destruction. Lucien felt his chest tighten with something between fear and recognition that she was right. They'll tear you apart. Use you as evidence that I've corrupted you with radical ideas. Turn you into another weapon against me. Let them try. I've been weaponized before. This time, I'm doing it consciously. Marcus cleared his throat. Lady Seraphina, with respect, appearing before Parliament or Crown officials without proper legal representation is strategic suicide. Then come with me, both of you. We present unified front. Show them that destroying these schools requires destroying all three of us publicly. Make the cost of cruelty visible enough that political calculation favors mercy. Lucien crossed the room until he stood directly in front of her. If we do this and lose, you lose everything. Not just the schools, your reputation, your future opportunities. Everything you've built gets erased. Seraphina met his eyes without flinching. Then we better not lose. The certainty in her voice was the same tone she'd used standing in the cathedral, delivering her father's eulogy. Absolute conviction that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with having already made peace with consequences. Lucien understood in that moment why he'd been unable to forget her. Not because she was beautiful, or politically valuable, or strategically useful. Because she possessed courage that didn't require power to sustain itself. The kind of strength his empire had been built to destroy because it threatened every foundation his father had taught him to protect. "We leave today," he said, "before the Crown expects us to move. Before Damien has time to prepare additional legal warfare. We go to London and force this confrontation on our terms." Marcus stood slowly. "This is comprehensive gamble. You understand that if we fail, there's no recovery, no rebuilding, just permanent defeat. Then we'll fail spectacularly enough that someone remembers why we tried." The journey to London took 3 days through October storms that turned England's roads into rivers of mud. They traveled in a hired coach that had seen better decades, accompanied by 2 village miners who'd volunteered as protection with the kind of loyalty money couldn't purchase. The trip gave Lucien time to understand exactly how much he'd changed since leaving London a month ago. His hands were calloused now. His shoulders carried the kind of strength that came from physical labor rather than inherited authority. His mind worked differently, calculating value in terms of human impact rather than political leverage. He'd become someone his father wouldn't recognize. The realization should have felt like loss. Instead, it felt like escape from a prison he'd been trained not to notice. Seraphina spent the journey drafting testimony that would either save the schools or provide evidence for the Crown to destroy her completely. She wrote with focused intensity, occasionally reading passages aloud to gauge their rhetorical impact. Marcus coordinated legal strategy and prepared documentation, showing every Crown claim about the school's improper operation was fabricated retaliation disguised as legitimate governance. They arrived in London on a Thursday evening when the city was transitioning between business hours and evening entertainment. The streets smelled like coal smoke and ambition, and the particular desperation of people convinced their suffering mattered less than economic efficiency. Lucien had forgotten how suffocating London felt after Dunmire's brutal honesty. They took rooms at a modest hotel in Bloomsbury, far from aristocratic districts where Lucien's presence would trigger immediate attention. The goal was surprise, Appear before the relevant authorities before Damien could coordinate defensive responses. That night, Lucien stood at his hotel window watching London's familiar chaos and feeling like a foreigner in the city he'd once dominated. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Seraphina entered without waiting for invitation, carrying tea she'd somehow acquired despite the late hour. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Thinking about tomorrow, how badly this could go." She handed him tea that tasted like chamomile and resignation. "I've been thinking about the winter masquerade," she said quietly. "About what you said that night." "Seraphina, I've apologized. I'm not asking for another apology. I'm trying to understand something. When you called me mediocre, did you believe it?" The question hit harder than accusation would have. Lucien set down his tea with careful precision. "Yes. In that moment, I believed it completely. You didn't fit the template I'd been taught to value. No strategic family connections, no performative beauty, no obvious utility to my interests. So I dismissed you as mediocre because mediocrity was easier to ignore than complexity. And now? Now I understand I was measuring worth using tools designed to miss everything that actually matters. You weren't mediocre. I was blind." Seraphina moved to stand beside him at the window, both of them watching London's nighttime machinery grind forward with mechanical indifference. "I hated you for 5 months," she said. "Genuinely hated you. Not for the insult itself, but for making me doubt whether I was wrong about my own value. For putting that voice in my head that whispered maybe he was right." Her voice carried pain that hadn't fully scarred over. Lucien felt shame settle into his bones in ways that political defeat had never achieved. "I'm sorry. For creating that doubt. For using cruelty so casually. For being exactly this kind of man my father raised me to become. But you're not that man anymore. I'm trying not to be. Don't know if that's enough." She turned to face him directly. "You destroyed your empire to protect schools you had no obligation to care about. You stood against armed men to defend children you'd never met. You spent a month doing physical labor that aristocracy would consider beneath you. That's not trying. That's transformation. Or it's penance that looks like change without actually addressing the fundamental flaws. Maybe. But penance done with genuine effort is still progress." Thunder rolled across London, storm systems following them from the coast. "Tomorrow, we face the Crown's judgment," Lucien said. "They're going to tear apart everything we've built. Use our own testimony against us. Prove that funding the schools was reckless sentiment rather than sound strategy. Let them. Because the children learning to read in Dunmire are real, whether the Crown acknowledges them or not. We built something that matters, that survives regardless of what London thinks. You have more faith than I do." Not faith. Stubbornness. There's a difference. She smiled with exhaustion that made her look both older and more resilient than London society had ever allowed her to be. "Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you. For trying, for changing, for proving that men built to dominate can learn to serve instead. Thank you for showing me what was possible. I wouldn't have known to look without you." They stood at the window in silence while London continued its eternal routines and the future remained terrifyingly uncertain. Eventually, Seraphina left to get what sleep she could manage. Lucien remained at the window until dawn turned the Thames gold and the city woke to face another day of calculated cruelty disguised as civilization. Today would determine whether transformation was real or if monsters could only pretend to be human for limited periods before reverting to nature. He dressed in formal clothing that felt foreign after weeks in work clothes. The Duke of Ravenscar's armor. Tailored precision designed to intimidate through presentation. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. Not because his appearance had changed dramatically, because the man wearing these clothes had fundamentally different priorities than the one who'd worn them a month ago. That man had measured success in political dominance and accumulated power. This man measured it in children learning to read and communities given opportunity. The difference was everything. The Crown's Chamber for Administrative Hearings occupied a building near Westminster that had been designed specifically to make petitioners feel small. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, portraits of monarchs whose expressions suggested permanent disapproval. Seating arranged so that those being judged sat alone while authority elevated itself literally and symbolically above them. Lucien, Seraphina, and Marcus entered at precisely 9 in the morning to find the chamber already filled with opposition. Lord Lucien Ravenscar sat with Crown attorneys. Lord Chancellor Graves presided with the expression of someone conducting an execution rather than a hearing. Earl Valemont attended as interested party, his daughter Helena beside him, wearing satisfaction like expensive jewelry. The gallery held journalists, parliamentary observers, and aristocrats who'd come to watch England's former most powerful duke be destroyed by his own poor judgment. This was theater designed to humiliate before reaching any legal conclusion. Lord Chancellor Graves called the hearing to order with mechanical efficiency. This hearing will determine the competency of Duke Lucien Ravenscar to maintain control of his remaining holdings, and whether said holdings have been deployed in manner consistent with ducal responsibilities and crown interests. Lord Damien Ravenscar has petitioned for custodianship based on demonstrated incompetence. Evidence will be presented and evaluated. He gestured toward Damien. Proceed. Damien stood with practiced grace. The evidence is straightforward. My cousin has liquidated 60% of ancestral holdings without strategic purpose. Rejected crown-sanctioned marriage alliance. Deployed remaining funds to support educational programs of questionable legality in economically irrelevant regions, and demonstrated emotional instability by prioritizing personal attachment over familial and national interests. He presented documents meticulously prepared to make every one of Lucien's recent decisions look like madness rather than choice. Furthermore, Damien continued, Duke Ravenscar has endangered the very institutions he claims to support by making them vulnerable to crown retaliation. Had he maintained proper political relationships, these schools could have operated with protection. Instead, his recklessness has endangered both the programs and the children involved. The argument was clever. Frame Lucien's transformation as incompetence that hurt the very people he was trying to help. Lord Chancellor Graves turned toward Lucien. Duke Ravenscar. Response? Lucien stood slowly. Every decision I've made was deliberate, calculated to achieve specific goals, even if those goals don't align with traditional measures of ducal success. I liquidated holdings to remove myself from political machinery that was using people as leverage against me. I rejected the Valemont marriage because strategic alliance built on coercion is just sophisticated slavery. And I supported the Dunmire schools because education that enables social mobility is more valuable than accumulated wealth that does nothing but compound itself. Damien laughed with theatrical derision. Noble words, practically meaningless. You've destroyed our family legacy for sentiment. I've repurposed it for utility. Our father built an empire that terrified people into obedience. I'm trying to build something that helps people improve their circumstances. That's not incompetence. That's different priorities. Lord Chancellor Graves interrupted. Different priorities that endanger crown interests constitute incompetence when you're a duke. Your position carries responsibilities beyond personal preference. Then strip the title. Give it to Damien. Let him rebuild the machinery I dismantled. But the schools remain funded through legal structures you can't touch without proving you're destroying children's education for political revenge. The chamber fell silent. This was the calculated exposure Marcus had mentioned. Force the crown to choose between obvious cruelty and allowing transformation. Lord Chancellor Graves's expression hardened. You're attempting to manipulate this hearing through emotional appeal. I'm forcing you to acknowledge what you're actually destroying. Let Lady Seraphina testify about what those schools provide. Let her show you the children learning to read. Let her prove that what you're calling incompetence is actually the most competent thing I've ever done. Graves looked like he wanted to refuse but couldn't without appearing afraid of evidence. Lady Seraphina may present testimony. Seraphina stood and moved to the center position with the same composure she'd shown delivering her father's eulogy. Her voice carried through the chamber with unexpected strength. The Dunmire schools serve 43 children currently, minors' children who've never had access to education because their families lack resources and their region lacks infrastructure. We teach reading, writing, basic mathematics, skills that enable social mobility and economic opportunity. Every child in our program is there because someone finally gave them a chance that society decided they didn't deserve. She pulled out documents. These are writing samples. Letters from 7-year-olds learning to spell their own names for the first time. Essays from 12-year-olds analyzing stories they've read. Mathematics from children calculating mining efficiency improvements that could save their fathers' lives. This is what you're calling incompetent resource allocation. Earl Valemont interrupted. Touching stories, irrelevant to the question of whether Duke Ravenscar is fit to manage his holdings. Seraphina turned toward him with cold precision. The question of fitness depends on what you think dukes are supposed to accomplish. If the goal is accumulating power that controls people, then yes, Lucien is incompetent. But if the goal is using inherited resources to create opportunities that compound across generations, then he's the most competent noble in this room. Helena Valemont stood with her father. You're biased, personally involved with Duke Ravenscar in ways that compromise your objectivity. Seraphina smiled without warmth. I'm absolutely biased. Biased toward children learning to read. Biased toward communities given opportunity. Biased toward using power for something other than preserving itself. And yes, I'm personally involved with a man who chose to become better than what he was raised to be. If that compromises my objectivity, then objectivity is vastly overrated. The gallery stirred with competing reactions. Lord Chancellor Graves restored order by force of authority. This hearing will recess for deliberation. Parties will remain available for recall. The chamber emptied slowly, tension following everyone out like smoke. In a private room set aside for their use, Lucien, Seraphina, and Marcus waited for the judgment that would determine everything. How bad was it? Marcus asked. Unclear. We exposed their cruelty. Whether that matters depends on whether the Crown cares more about political control or public perception. Lucien stood at the window overlooking London's governmental district, where empires were maintained through paperwork and casual destruction. Seraphina was magnificent, he said quietly. Absolutely fearless. Marcus nodded. She was. But fearlessness doesn't always win against entrenched power. They waited 3 hours. Finally, a clerk summoned them back to the hearing chamber. Lord Chancellor Graves sat with an expression that revealed nothing. The room held its collective breath. This hearing has evaluated evidence regarding Duke Lucien Ravenscar's competency to maintain his remaining holdings. The Crown finds his recent decisions unorthodox and strategically questionable. However, incompetence requires demonstrated inability to manage resources effectively. The Dunmire schools, while politically problematic, are operationally sound. The liquidation of holdings, while personally disadvantageous, was executed with legal precision. The rejection of marriage alliance, while diplomatically unfortunate, falls within ducal autonomy. The pause felt like drowning. Therefore, this hearing finds Duke Ravenscar competent to maintain his reduced holdings. Lord Damien Ravenscar's petition for custodianship is denied. Damien shot to his feet. The Crown also finds that the Dunmire schools operate within legal parameters, and will not be, subject to further administrative interference unless actual violations are documented rather than alleged. Graves fixed Lucien with a stare that carried warning. However, Duke Ravenscar, understand this clearly. You've removed yourself from structures that previously protected you. You are now politically isolated. Any future conflicts will find you without allies who once considered your power worth preserving. Choose your battles carefully. He struck his gavel once. This hearing is concluded. The chamber erupted into noise. Lucien felt something in his chest that might have been relief if his body still remembered what that felt like. Seraphina grabbed his arm with fingers that shook from adrenaline crash. We won. We survived. There's a difference. I'll take survival. Marcus was already gathering documents with movements that suggested he'd been holding his breath for 3 hours and had just remembered how to exhale. Damien stormed out without meeting Lucien's eyes, defeat written across his expression in ways that suggested this wasn't finished despite the formal ruling. But for now, they'd protected the schools, preserved the funding, proven that transformation was possible even if it cost everything comfortable. Outside the hearing chamber, London continued its routines with mechanical indifference. Lucien stood on the building steps with Seraphina and Marcus, breathing air that tasted like survival, and something more complicated than victory. What happens now? Seraphina asked. Now we return to Dunmire. Continue building. Prove that this wasn't temporary performance, but permanent change. And when the next attack comes? Because Damien won't accept this. Neither will the Crown's interests that wanted you compliant. Then we face it together, same as we face this. Seraphina looked at him with an expression that held exhaustion and something softer. You really believe that? That we can keep building despite everyone wanting us to fail? I believe we have to try, because the alternative is accepting that power's only legitimate use is preserving itself, and I'm done accepting that. They walked through London's evening traffic toward the modest hotel where they'd left their limited belongings. Tomorrow, they'd begin the journey back to Dunmire. Back to 43 children who needed teachers more than they needed aristocratic drama. Back to work that left Lucien's hands bleeding and his back aching and his mind clear in ways political dominance had never achieved. Back to building something that might outlast them both if they were careful and lucky and relentlessly stubborn. That night, Lucien wrote a letter to his younger self. Not the man who'd humiliated Seraphina at the winter masquerade. The boy who'd inherited a dukedom at 19 and decided power was the only thing worth pursuing. The words came slowly. You're going to spend 13 years building an empire you don't respect. You're going to hurt people because cruelty feels efficient. You're going to call a woman mediocre and spend 5 months unable to forget her eyes. You're going to destroy everything you've built, and it's going to be the best decision you ever make. Because empires built on domination eventually collapse into their own cruelty. Because power without purpose is just accumulated fear. Because the woman you dismissed as mediocre will show you what strength actually looks like. You're going to learn that transformation is possible but not painless. That becoming better requires destroying who you were. That the courage to want something without owning it is harder than any political warfare you'll ever conduct. You're going to fail more than you succeed. Hurt people you're trying to help. Make mistakes that compound into disasters. But you're going to keep trying. And that persistence is going to matter more than any victory you achieved through dominance. 13 years from now, you'll stand on coastal cliffs teaching miners' children to read and understand that this is what power was supposed to become. Not control, service, not possession, partnership, not fear. Respect earned through competence and maintained through consistency. The journey between who you are and who you could be is going to destroy you. Let it. Some things are worth burning empires to discover. He folded the letter and placed it in his journal beside contracts that had ended his political life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, he'd survived the hearing that should have destroyed everything. And tomorrow he'd wake up in a world where children in Dunmire were learning to read because someone had finally decided their potential mattered more than aristocratic power games. That alone was victory enough. Beck. 6 months later, Dunmire had transformed. The schools now served 87 children across 3 locations. Seraphina had hired 2 additional teachers, both women from mining families who'd been educated in secret and now taught openly. The curriculum had expanded to include history, basic science, and practical skills that would enable graduates to pursue opportunities beyond the mines. Lucien had become a permanent fixture in the community. Not as the Duke of Ravenscar, but as the man who fixed broken desks and taught mathematics and showed up every morning regardless of weather or exhaustion. His hands were permanently calloused now. His formal clothes had been sold to fund additional school supplies. His title remained technically, but existed more as historical artifact than current identity. He'd become exactly what his father would have considered failure, which meant he'd finally succeeded at something real. On a March evening, when winter was releasing its grip on the coastline, Lucien stood on the cliffs above the primary school, watching sunset turn the North Sea gold. Seraphina joined him without announcement, their pattern over 6 months of working side by side. "Thinking about London?" she asked. "Thinking about how much has changed, how different this life is from what I thought I wanted. Better or worse?" "Different. More honest. Harder physically, easier morally." She smiled at the assessment. "The children asked about you today. Wanted to know if you were really a duke or if that was just village rumor. What did you tell them? That you used to be a duke? Now you're just someone who teaches mathematics and fixes things when they break." Accurate summary. Thunder rolled across the horizon without rain following. Storm systems moving parallel to the coast instead of crashing into it. "I've been thinking about that night at the winter masquerade," Seraphina said quietly. "About whether I've forgiven you for what you said." "Have you?" She considered the question with the same analytical precision she brought to curriculum development. "I've forgiven the man who said it. He was operating from programming he didn't know how to question. But I'll never forget what those words felt like. The humiliation, the doubt they created, the proof that society's judgment could be weaponized so casually. I wouldn't want you to forget. Forgetting would mean it didn't matter. It mattered. It still matters. But it doesn't define either of us anymore." Lucien turned to face her directly. "I love you. Not as possession, not as political alliance, not as solution to loneliness, but as recognition that you're the person who showed me what I could become if I stopped defending what I'd been. Seraphina held his gaze with eyes that had learned to see through aristocratic performance to actual substance. I love you too. Not because you saved my schools, not because you destroyed your empire, but because you chose to transform even when transformation meant losing everything comfortable. They kissed on the cliff edge while the North Sea continued its eternal assault against rocks that had outlasted countless human dramas. Below them, the school stood solid against wind that would have destroyed weaker construction. Inside, lesson plans for tomorrow waited alongside books that 43 children would read before dawn broke and work claimed their parents again. This was the empire Lucien had built to replace the one he'd destroyed. Not territory or wealth or political dominance, just space where people could learn and grow and become more than the circumstances that had defined their parents. Small by aristocratic standards, infinite by measures that actually mattered. When they broke apart, Seraphina smiled with the kind of exhaustion that came from meaningful work rather than empty performance. Race you back to the village. Loser teaches morning mathematics. You're going to lose. I've been doing physical labor for 6 months now. Confidence from a man whose legs are twice as long as mine. That's just inherited advantage. Then I'll give you a head start. Patronizing. I'll remember that when I'm grading your teaching performance. She took off running before he could respond, her laugh carrying back across the cliff path like music. Lucien followed, his own laughter mixing with hers, and the wind and the sound of waves destroying themselves against stone that would outlast them both. By the time they reached the village, both were breathing hard and arguing about who'd actually won and whether the bet was binding if the terms hadn't been fully negotiated. Margaret watched from the boarding house entrance with the amused tolerance of someone who'd seen transformation happen slowly enough to believe it was permanent. You two are going to scandalize this village eventually, she observed. We're rebuilding schools and teaching children to read, Seraphina protested. How is that scandalous? Not the schools. The way you look at each other, like you've discovered something the rest of us missed. Maybe we have, Lucien said quietly. Margaret smiled. Then make sure you protect it. Good things in this world are rare and fragile, worth defending. They went inside to prepare lessons for the next day. And as March evening settled over Dunmire with the gentle certainty of seasons changing, the coastal village continued its routines with two people who'd learned that empires built on service outlasted empires built on dominance. That transformation was possible but required destroying comfortable lies. That love without possession was harder than any political warfare, but infinitely more valuable. That calling someone mediocre was cruelty, that revealed the judge's blindness rather than the judge's worth. That power's highest achievement wasn't control, but liberation. That men raised to dominate could learn to serve if they found reasons strong enough to justify the painful work of becoming better. And that sometimes the most important victories happened in forgotten coastal provinces where miners' children learned to read and nobody in London remembered or cared about the duke who'd traded. Empire for purpose. The North Sea crashed endlessly against cliffs that would outlast every empire. Inside the village, lights burned late into evening as lessons were prepared and futures were rebuilt, one child at a time. And high above them all, stars emerged as the storm finally cleared, indifferent, eternal, witnessing another small human drama about transformation and redemption play out beneath their ancient light. The Duke of Ravenscar was dead. What remained was just a man who'd learned that the hardest battle wasn't conquering others, but conquering yourself. And that victory, unlike every triumph that came before, actually meant something.